Tonight, we're diving into 10,000 years of one of the darkest houses ever to cast its shadow across the human universe. The complete history of House Harkonnen. From a single act of cowardice in an ancient battle to the night the last of their name fell in the sand. Settle in now. Let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing to fear here, only a slow and even voice tracing the long, cold rise and fall of a family built on cruelty and cunning. If these long, quiet stories are the ones that finally carry you under, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming, night after night. And that is the only small thing I will ask of you before we begin. Over the next 20 chapters, we will move, without haste, through a name born in disgrace, an ancient feud that never died, an industrial world beneath a black sun, a monstrous baron and his twisted schemers, a trap laid on a desert planet, and the slow undoing of everything they built. You do not need to hold on to any of it, and none of it can reach you where you are. Let it move through you, like a cold wind fading at the edge of sleep, and let it carry you, softly, down toward rest. Long before the desert planet Arrakis ever turned beneath twin moons in the memory of any living voice, before the word Fremen carried the weight it would one day carry, before spice was more than a rumor passed between traders on the edges of a settled galaxy, there was a war so vast and so slow that it swallowed generations whole. It was called the Butlerian Jihad, and it stretched across long centuries in which humankind rose up against the thinking machines it had once built to serve it, and against the Cymex who had joined their flesh to metal, and against everything that had ever dared to compute a human soul into a number. You do not need to remember every battle of that war tonight. You need only remember its ending, for it is there, in the last great exhaustion of that struggle, that our story quietly begins. The final battle of the Jihad was fought at a place called Corrin, and it was there that the combined forces of humanity gathered themselves for what would be the closing blow against the machine armies that still resisted extinction. Fleets of a scale almost too large to hold in the mind converged on that world, and among the many noble bloodlines who sent their sons and their ships to stand in that battle was a family whose name would, in time, come to mean something altogether different from what it meant on that day. The family was called Harkonnen, and on the day of Corrin they were not yet feared. They were, like so many others, simply hoping to survive, and to be remembered afterward as having done their duty. Among the Harkonnen who fought at Corrin was a man named Abelard Harkonnen, and it is with him, gently, that the long chain of consequence truly starts. Abelard was given a command in that final assault, a position of responsibility amid the chaos of ships and fire. And whatever happened to him in the confusion of that battle, whatever fear moved through him, or whatever decision he made in the smoke and static of a moment too large for any single man to master, the outcome was this. He was accused, before the eyes of the united houses, of failing in his duty. He was accused of a hesitation that cost lives, of a retreat that looked, to those who judged him, indistinguishable from cowardice. And the one who brought this accusation forward, the one whose testimony sealed the matter, was a man from another family entirely, a family that would come to stand across an eternity of distance from the Harkonnen name. That man was Vorian Atreides. Vorian Atreides was no simple soldier. He was a man of long life and complicated history, one of the few humans who had lived across centuries touched by machine influence and machine longevity. And when he spoke of what he had witnessed at Corrin, the other great houses listened, because his word carried the particular weight of a survivor who had seen too much to lie carelessly. Whether his account of Abelard's conduct was entirely just, whether it captured the full truth of a young officer overwhelmed in the closing hour of humanity's longest war, is a question that history left unanswered, even as it rendered its verdict. What mattered, in the end, was not the fullness of the truth, but the finality of the judgment. Abelard Harkonnen was found guilty of cowardice in the face of the enemy. And with that single word, cowardice, the entire house that carried his name was cast down. It is a strange thing how one word spoken in one moment can settle like dust across 10,000 years. The Harkonnen family, in the aftermath of Corrin, did not lose their lives. They lost something that, in the aristocratic order of the Landsraad, was almost worse than life. They lost their honor, and with it, the lands and titles and standing that honor had once secured for them. Where they had stood among the victors of the greatest war humanity had ever fought, they now stood apart from it, marked, diminished, spoken of in low voices as the house that broke at Corrin. Doors that had once opened easily now closed. Alliances that had once been assumed now had to be earned again, slowly, if they could be earned at all. The name Harkonnen, which might have been carried with the same quiet pride as any other noble lineage, became instead a name that had to be lived down, generation after generation, by descendants who had not even been born when the judgment fell. And it is worth resting here a moment, in the stillness after that verdict, to notice the particular shape of the wound that was made that day. It was not only a wound of pride, it was a wound of memory. Because the Atreides name, the name of the very man whose word had condemned them, would go on to rise in stature across the centuries that followed, becoming a house known for its honor, its directness, its old-fashioned nobility of bearing. Every time the name Atreides was spoken with respect in some hall of the Landsraad, somewhere in the shadow of that respect lived the old fact of Corrin. The fact that it was an Atreides who had spoken the word that broke a Harkonnen. Two houses, then, began their long, parallel journey through history from that single point. One house rising in the light of honor, rightly or wrongly earned. The other house sinking into a darkness it would spend 10,000 years trying to climb back out of, and never quite forgiving. It would be easy, lying here in the quiet, to imagine that history simply moved on, that the shamed house faded away and was forgotten, the way so many disgraced families faded from the old records of dead empires. But that is not what happened. The Harkonnen did not fade. Something in the disgrace of Corrin, something in the bitterness of being cast down by a name that would only grow more celebrated with time, hardened into a kind of patience within that bloodline, a willingness to wait, to endure, to plot across centuries rather than years, to rebuild not through the open honor that had failed them, but through cunning, through commerce, through whatever quiet and unglamorous means might one day return them to power. They would learn, in the long dark of their exile, that revenge served slowly and coldly outlasts anger that burns itself out in a single generation. And though none of them yet knew it, none of the descendants of Abelard who would be born in the centuries after Corrin, a seed had been planted in the soil of that disgrace. A seed that would not flower for thousands of years, but that would, when it finally did flower, reach all the way to a desert planet called Arrakis, and to a family called Atreides, and to a reckoning that the galaxy itself would remember. For now, though, let it rest as it was, a battle won against the machines, A name disgraced among the victors. A single accusing voice that would echo across 10 millennia. And a house that would carry its shame quietly into the dark, learning in that darkness how to wait. Consider for a moment the strange mercy hidden inside even so cold a judgment. Had Abelard Harkonnen been executed outright for his failure, had the assembled houses chosen the swifter and harsher penalty that some among them surely favored in the raw aftermath of so costly a war, there would have been no house left to carry the shame forward at all. No bloodline remaining to feel the weight of it across the centuries. No story left to tell in the quiet hours of a much later age. But the judgment rendered was disgrace, not death. And disgrace, unlike death, leaves something behind to suffer with it. It leaves children who must grow up hearing the whispers that follow their family name into every room. It leaves grandchildren who must decide again and again across their own lifetimes whether to accept the shame quietly or to spend their days working against it. In sparing the life of the house while destroying its honor, the judges of Corrin created something far more durable than a single execution could ever have produced. A wound that could be inherited, passed down like a strange and terrible birthright from one generation to the next, always fresh, never quite closing. It is worth imagining, too, gently, what that first generation of shamed Harkonnen must have felt in the years immediately following Corrin. The particular ache of watching former comrades in arms rise to positions of honor and reward, while their own family was quietly excluded from the victory celebrations that followed the war's ending. The jihad had been humanity's longest and most costly struggle, a war fought not merely for territory or wealth, but for the very right of human beings to remain the masters of their own civilization, rather than servants to machines of their own making. And its ending was met, across the settled worlds, with a relief so profound that it bordered on religious feeling. Every house that had fought at Corrin, and fought well, was folded into that relief, celebrated, honored, given new grants of land and new positions of trust within the reorganizing imperium that would rise from the war's ashes. Every house, that is, except the one that carried Abelard's name, which found itself standing at the edges of that celebration, watching from a distance that would only grow wider with each passing year, learning in that painful watching the first lessons of the patience that would define them for 10,000 years to come. Up next in Chapter 2, The Feud That Never Died, will follow the slow centuries in which the disgrace of Corrin hardened into something else entirely, a lasting enmity between the House of Atreides and the House of Harkonnen, sealed in the old, formal vendetta the Landsrat called Canley, and carried forward by two bloodlines who grew, across the long turning of ages, into perfect and opposite reflections of each other. In the long years that followed the judgment at Corrin, something settled over the relationship between the House of Harkonnen and the House of Atreides that no treaty could dissolve and no passage of centuries could soften. It was not merely a grudge, the way two neighboring families might carry a grudge over a disputed field or a broken promise. It became something closer to a law of nature, a fixed opposition, written so deeply into the bones of both houses that their descendants, thousands of years removed from the battle that started it all, would still feel its pull without always remembering why. This is the quiet, slow shape of what came to be called, in the old formal language of the Landsrat, Canley. Canley was not simple violence. The great houses of the Imperium had long ago learned that unrestrained war between noble families threatened to unravel the entire fragile order that let civilization function at all. The delicate balance of trade and fealty and mutual restraint that kept the Padishah Emperor's peace from shattering into chaos. And so, vendetta, when it could not be avoided, was channeled instead into something with rules, something with form. A controlled and formal feud in which grievances could be pursued according to ancient codes rather than through open slaughter. It was war conducted with the manners of a duel, aggression wrapped in ceremony, hatred given a shape it could be recognized by. And it was into this old and careful tradition that the wound of Corrin eventually poured itself, generation after generation, until the enmity between Harkonnen and Atreides became one of the oldest and most enduring feuds the Imperium had ever known. What made this particular feud so remarkable, so durable across the ages, was not simply its age, but the way it seemed to draw out and sharpen something essential in the character of each house, as though the long opposition had acted like a whetstone upon two blades of entirely different metal. The Atreides, across the centuries, cultivated a reputation for honor that became almost a kind of religion unto itself. They were known as a house that kept its word, even when keeping it cost them dearly. A house whose lords led from the front, rather than from behind walls of hired protection. A house that inspired a fierce and genuine loyalty among the people who served them. Not merely the obedience that fear can purchase, but the deeper loyalty that only comes from being treated, in some real measure, as though one's life mattered. This was not sentiment alone. It was also, in its way, a shrewd understanding of power. Because a lord who is loved does not need to spend as much to be obeyed. But whatever mixture of genuine virtue and practical wisdom produced it, the Atreides' reputation for nobility became, across 10,000 years, a kind of fixed star in the sky of the Landsraad, a name that other houses measured their own honor against. The Harkonnen, in the same centuries, grew into something that seemed almost deliberately shaped to be that star's opposite. Where the Atreides ruled through the appearance and often the substance of honor, the Harkonnen came to rule through cunning, through indirection, through a patient willingness to let others believe one thing, while the truth moved quietly elsewhere. This was not, in the beginning, a matter of pure cruelty for its own sake. It was, at least at first, closer to a hardened pragmatism born of disgrace, a lesson learned in the aftermath of Corrin that open dealing and public honor had once cost the family everything, and that the safer path forward was to keep one's true intentions hidden until the moment they could no longer be stopped. But pragmatism, nursed carefully across enough centuries, can calcify into something else. And by the time the Harkonnen name had traveled far enough from Corrin, that careful pragmatism had hardened into a family character built on deception as a first instinct rather than a last resort. On treachery not merely as a tool, but almost as a kind of pride, a dark mirror held up to the Atreides' brightness. It is worth pausing, in the gentle quiet of this telling, to notice how these two houses, without ever intending it, became necessary to each other's story. A house of pure and uncomplicated honor needs, in some sense, a shadow to be honorable against, a contrast that gives its virtues their shape and their meaning. And a house of cunning and treachery, in turn, finds a particular satisfaction in being opposed by an adversary whose very goodness can be used against it, whose insistence on fair dealing can be turned, patiently, into vulnerability. Neither house, across the long ages of the feud, ever fully destroyed the other. And this, too, was part of the pattern. Because Canley, formal and bounded as it was, tended to produce long stalemates rather than swift annihilations. generation trading blow for careful blow with generation, neither side willing to let the old wound close, because closing it would mean admitting that the wound no longer mattered. And for the Harkonnen especially, it always mattered. Across these centuries, the feud was carried forward, sometimes through open acts, sometimes through nothing more than a chill formality, maintained whenever the two houses were forced into the same rooms of the Landsraad. A coldness understood by everyone present, even when no word of the old history was spoken aloud. Marriages between the two houses were, naturally, unthinkable. Alliances of convenience, when the wider currents of imperial politics briefly seemed to call for them, were entered into with the deepest suspicion and abandoned at the first opportunity. And beneath all of it, quietly, patiently, the Harkonnen never stopped remembering that it had been an Atreides voice that had named their ancestor a coward before all the assembled houses of the jihad's aftermath, and never stopped waiting for a moment when that debt might finally, completely be repaid. It would take many, many centuries yet before that moment arrived, before the deepest layer of the old feud found its way onto the sands of a desert world that neither house yet had reason to think about. A world of spice and silence that would one day become the place where 10,000 years of quiet hatred finally spent themselves in full. But that is a part of the story still sleeping, far ahead of us tonight. And it will keep, patiently, the way the Harkonnen themselves learned to keep their patience, until the right hour comes to wake it. For now, it is enough to hold this simple, heavy truth in mind as the eyes grow heavier. Two houses, born from the same terrible war, shaped forever afterward into opposites, honor on one side and treachery on the other, bound together by a hatred old enough to have forgotten some of its own details, but never old enough to forget its own existence. There is a peaceful, almost meditative quality to observing how such an ancient enmity settles into the ordinary rhythms of a civilization across so many centuries. The way a river settles into a canyon, cutting its path a little deeper with each passing season, without ever seeming, in any single year, to move at all. Children of the Atreides line were raised knowing, in a general and unhurried way, that the Harkonnen were the family one did not trust, the family whose smiling word required a second and a third examination before it could be believed. Children of the Harkonnen line were raised knowing, in their own general and unhurried way, that the Atreides were the family whose easy honor had once been used to condemn an ancestor, the family whose very reputation for goodness was itself, in some deep Harkonnen sense, a kind of insult that had never been properly answered. Neither side needed to rehearse the full history of Corrin at every mention of the other name. The feeling itself had long since become inherited instinct, passed down the way a family passes down the shape of a nose or the color of eyes, requiring no conscious teaching at all. And so the centuries turned, slow and steady, each one adding its own small chapter to the quiet war between the two houses. Chapters mostly forgotten now, mostly indistinguishable from one another in the great sweep of imperial history. Disputes over trading rights on some minor world, disagreements over precedence at some minor gathering of the Landsraad, small cruelties exchanged and small honors withheld. None of these single moments mattered greatly on their own. What mattered was their accumulation, the way each one added its weight to a scale that had been tipped from the very first day at Corrin, and that neither house, across all those years, ever quite managed, or even truly wished, to set right again. Up next, in Chapter 3, The Long Climb Back to Power, we'll follow the Harkonnen as they begin, slowly and patiently across the turning of centuries, the long and careful work of climbing back from disgrace toward wealth and standing, using trade routes and careful alliances and the growing power of interstellar commerce to reclaim a seat among the great houses of the Landsraad. Disgrace, as the Harkonnen learned across the long years after Corrin, is a debt that cannot be repaid through any single grand gesture. There was no battle to be won that would erase the word cowardice from the family record. No single act of valor that could stand against the settled judgment of the assembled houses. What disgrace demanded instead, if it was ever to be answered at all, was time and patience, and the slow accumulation of a different kind of power than the one that had been lost. And so, across the many centuries that followed the ruin of their honor, the House of Harkonnen turned its attention away from the battlefield entirely and towards something quieter, something that history rarely celebrates in songs, but that proved, in the end, far more durable than any single military glory. The patient, grinding work of commerce. It began, as these things often do, in modest places. Stripped of the standing that had once opened doors among the great and honored houses of the Landsraad, the Harkonnen turned to whatever ventures remained available to a family that could no longer trade on reputation. And they found that the galaxy, vast and endlessly hungry for goods and transport and the movement of resources between worlds, did not particularly care whether a merchant's name carried honor, only whether that merchant could deliver what was promised, and deliver it reliably, and deliver it at a profit. In this indifferent arithmetic of trade, the Harkonnen discovered an opening that the battlefield had denied them. Nobody asked a shipping contract whether its signer had been brave at Corrin. Nobody asked a mining concession whether the family that held it deserved forgiveness. The ledgers of interstellar commerce were blind in a way that the halls of the Landsraad had never been. And into that blindness, the disgraced house poured everything it had left. Across generations, the family that had once stood among the noble houses fighting the great jihad rebuilt itself instead as a family of traders, of investors, of quiet and careful accumulators of wealth. They learned the patterns of the great trading conglomerate known as CHOAM, the vast combine through which so much of the Imperium's commerce flowed. The spice and the metals and the manufactured goods of 10,000 worlds passing through channels that CHOAM controlled, and that the Emperor himself, along with the great houses, held shares within. To hold a directing share in CHOAM was to hold a kind of power that did not depend on the goodwill of the Landsraad, a power measured in Solaris rather than in honor. And the Harkonnen, generation after patient generation, worked to acquire more of that power, understanding instinctively what it had taken their disgrace to teach them. That wealth, patiently amassed, could eventually purchase what honor alone would never again grant them: influence, leverage, and eventually, standing. It is important, in telling this part of the story gently, not to imagine that the climb was swift or dramatic. It was neither. It unfolded across centuries in which individual Harkonnen lords lived and died, and were remembered, if at all, only within their own families' quiet ledgers. Men and women whose entire lives were spent adding some small increment to a fortune that would not fully mature until long after they themselves had turned to dust. There is a particular kind of patience required for this sort of work, a willingness to labor for outcomes one will never personally see. And whatever else can be said of the House of Harkonnen across its long history, it must be said that they possessed this patience in extraordinary measure. Where the Atreides, across these same centuries, continued to build their reputation through visible acts of leadership and honor that could be witnessed and admired within a single lifetime. The Harkonnen built something less visible and, in its own cold way, more relentless. A slowly compounding accumulation of resources that no single dramatic reversal could easily undo. Trade routes were secured, then expanded. Mining operations on harsh and unglamorous worlds were acquired cheaply from houses that did not yet see their future value, then developed patiently into steady sources of income. Alliances of convenience were formed with other merchant houses and trading concerns, alliances that carried none of the warmth of true friendship, but that served, transactionally, to open new markets and new opportunities. And slowly, so slowly that no single generation could have pointed to the precise moment when the family's fortunes turned, the House of Harkonnen accumulated enough wealth, enough chome influence, enough sheer economic weight, that it became impossible for the Landsraad to continue treating them as a disgraced footnote to history. Wealth of sufficient scale has its own gravity, and it began, slowly, to pull the Harkonnen name back toward the center of imperial affairs, whether or not the old shame of Corrin had ever truly been forgiven. By the time this long climb had run its course, the House of Harkonnen had reclaimed something it had lost 10,000 years before. A seat, once again, among the great houses of the Landsraad. A formal standing recognized by the Emperor and by the other noble families. A status that could not simply be waved away by old memories of cowardice, however much those memories lingered beneath the surface of every polite exchange. This was not forgiveness. The Atreides, and those who remembered the old history, never forgot what the Harkonnen name still carried within it. And the Harkonnen themselves, for their part, had not forgotten what had been done to them either. But status, once reclaimed through wealth, does not require forgiveness to function. It requires only enough economic and political weight that other houses find it more useful to deal with you than to continue shunning you. And by the careful, patient, centuries-long labor of trade and finance, the Harkonnen had finally accumulated exactly that much weight. And so, restored to a formal place among the great houses, though never restored in the deeper currency of honor and trust, the House of Harkonnen turned at last towards securing a proper seat, a proper home, a world upon which their reclaimed power could be centered and displayed and governed according to whatever character the family had grown into across its long and bitter exile. That world would become known, across the Imperium, by a name that would eventually inspire a particular kind of quiet dread in those who heard it spoken. Giedi Prime. It is worth resting a while longer on the peculiar patience this long climb required, because it stands as one of the truest expressions of what the House of Harkonnen had become in the wake of its disgrace. Other houses, watching from the outside across those centuries, might have assumed that a family cut off from honor would simply wither, would fade into irrelevance, the way so many lesser noble lines faded when fortune turned against them. But the Harkonnen understood something that fewer houses seemed to grasp with equal clarity, which was that the Imperium's true architecture of power ran not only through titles and honors bestowed by the Landsraad, but through the far quieter channels of ownership, of contracts, of shares held in the vast commercial bodies that moved goods and resources between 10,000 worlds. Honor could be denied by a vote of assembled lords. A well-placed share in a profitable venture could not so easily be taken away. And wealth, once accumulated in sufficient quantity, tended to attract more wealth to itself, compounding quietly across the generations in a manner that required no forgiveness from anyone at all. There is a certain calm to be found in imagining those centuries of steady, unglamorous labor, generation after generation of Harkonnen administrators and traders and investors doing the patient work of building something that none of them alone would live to see completed, content instead to add their portion to a fortune that belonged, in truth, to the family's future far more than to themselves. It was a strange kind of faith, this willingness to labor for descendants not yet born, and whatever else history would eventually say of the House of Harkonnen, it could never fairly say that they lacked the discipline to play a very long game indeed. Up next, in Chapter 4, Giedi Prime, World of the Black Sun. We'll travel to the industrial homeworld the Harkonnen built and ruled, a world of pollution and shadow beneath a dimmed and sunless sky, where fear replaced honor as the currency of rule, and where the long centuries of exile finally hardened into a governing philosophy that would echo for the rest of the family's history. There are worlds in the Imperium that seem, almost from the moment one arrives upon them, to have been shaped by the character of the family that rules them, as though ground and stone and sky had slowly absorbed something of their masters across the centuries and begun, quietly, to reflect it back. Giedi Prime was such a world, and to understand the House of Harkonnen in the fullness of what it became, it helps to rest for a while, gently, in the atmosphere of that place, to let its particular darkness settle over the mind the way it settled generation after generation, over everyone who lived beneath its sky. Giedi Prime was the homeworld the Harkonnen built into the center of their reclaimed power, and it was, from the very beginning of its long industrial development, a world given over entirely to production, to extraction, to the endless grinding work of manufacturing that fed the family's growing fortune. It had none of the softness of a garden world, none of the careful, cultivated beauty that other great houses sometimes built around their seats of power to project an image of grace and abundance. Giedi Prime was instead a world of factories and refineries, of vast industrial complexes that spread across its surface like something grown rather than built, consuming resources and producing wealth in a cycle that never paused, never rested, and never seemed to consider whether the people caught within that cycle were thriving or merely surviving. The sky above Giedi Prime carried a quality that those who visited from other worlds often found unsettling in a way they struggled to name precisely. The centuries of industrial output, the ceaseless exhaust of manufacturing on a planetary scale, had thickened the air itself, had dimmed the light of the world's sun until it reached the surface not as the clean brightness one might expect from a star, but as something duller, something almost bruised, a black sun hanging behind a permanent haze of pollution. It was under this dimmed and heavy light that the people of Giedi Prime lived their entire lives, and there was something fitting, something almost too perfectly symbolic in the way a world ruled by a family whose history was steeped in shadow and concealment should itself come to exist beneath a sky that had forgotten how to be truly bright. The cities of Giedi Prime, and above all its capital, carried this same character forward into their architecture and their daily rhythms. Structures rose in heavy, imposing shapes, built more for the impression of power than for any warmth of habitation, and the streets below moved to rhythms governed less by comfort than by function, by the needs of the industries that consumed the world's labor. There was little room in the ordinary life of Giedi Prime for joy pursued simply for its own sake. Pleasure, where it existed at all in the visible life of the world, tended to be pleasure of a harder and crueler kind. Entertainments built around dominance and suffering rather than delight, a pattern that would only deepen and darken as the centuries wore on, and the Harkonnen character settled ever more completely over the world they ruled. What governed Giedi Prime, above all else, was fear. And it is worth pausing on this word gently, because fear, as an instrument of rule, is a very different thing from the loyalty that other great houses, most notably the Atreides, cultivated among their own people. Where loyalty asks to be earned, and, once earned, sustains itself through mutual bonds of trust that can weather difficult seasons, fear must be continually renewed, continually demonstrated, lest it fade and be replaced by resentment strong enough to act. And so, the Harkonnen lords who ruled Giedi Prime across the generations learned to keep fear alive through visible and repeated displays of their own power, through punishments made deliberately public, through a governing style that treated the population beneath them less as subjects to be cared for than as resources to be managed, extracted from, and replaced when spent. This was not, it should be said gently, a philosophy adopted carelessly or without reason from the family's own perspective. It grew, in its own twisted way, from the same long history of disgrace and exile that had shaped the Harkonnen character across the centuries since Corrin. A family that had learned, through bitter experience, that honor and open dealing could be turned against you by those willing to exploit it, that had learned to survive through concealment and calculated cruelty rather than trust, would naturally build a homeworld that expressed those same values in stone and industry and law. Giedi Prime, in this sense, was not simply where the Harkonnen happened to live. It was the physical shape of what the family had become. A world that had absorbed 10,000 years of hardened bitterness and turned it into an entire civilization's operating principle. For the ordinary people of Giedi Prime, life beneath this system meant an existence lived carefully, quietly, without the security that people on more gently governed worlds might take for granted. Labor was demanded, and demanded harshly, in the vast industrial works that fed the family's wealth. Advancement, where it existed at all, tended to favor cruelty and cunning over honesty and diligence, because a system built on fear naturally rewards those who are skilled at inspiring it. And beneath the visible machinery of factories and refineries and armed enforcers, there moved a quieter undercurrent of suffering, borne by people who had little choice but to endure the world they had been born into. A suffering that the ruling house, comfortable in its fortified strongholds above the haze, rarely troubled itself to notice, except when that suffering became useful as spectacle, as a lesson to be made visible to others who might otherwise forget to be afraid. It was upon this foundation, this world of black skies and grinding industry and fear made into governing law, that the House of Harkonnen would eventually rise to its greatest heights of wealth and influence within the wider Imperium, heights that would in time bring them into direct and fateful contact with the desert world of Arrakis, and with the noble house that had first named their ancestor a coward at Corrin so many ages before. But those heights, and the particular figure who would come to embody them most completely in the memory of the galaxy, still lay some distance ahead in this telling. And for now, it is enough to simply rest in the image of that dimmed and heavy world, turning slowly beneath its black sun, patient, the way its people had been forced to become patient, waiting, as the family that ruled it had always waited, for its own hour to arrive. And yet, even beneath so heavy and dimmed a sky, life on Giedi Prime continued in its own way. Because life, even under the harshest governance, has a stubbornness that fear alone can never fully extinguish. Families formed and endured in the shadow of the factories. Small kindnesses passed quietly between neighbors who had learned, out of necessity, to trust one another more than they trusted the distant lords who ruled them. Children were born beneath the black sun, who knew no other sky, and so did not always think to mourn its absence of brightness, having nothing else to measure it against. There is a kind of sorrow in this, a quiet one, the sorrow of an entire world's population growing accustomed to a darkness that was never natural at all, but was instead the accumulated residue of one family's long and deliberate choices. Choices made in service of wealth and power, rather than the well-being of the people who lived and labored beneath their rule. It is worth noting, too, that the very industry which made Giedi Prime so grim to behold was also the engine that had finally lifted the Harkonnen name back into genuine relevance within the wider Imperium. The factories that darkened the sky were the same factories that filled the family's coffers, the same manufacturing might that gave the Harkonnen leverage in negotiations with other great houses, and standing within the great commercial combine of Chom. In this way, the very qualities that made Giedi Prime such an unlovely world to visit were inseparable from the qualities that made it, in the family's own reckoning, a triumph. Proof that the long climb back from the disgrace of Corrin had finally borne fruit, even if that fruit had grown in soil poisoned by the labor of others. Up next in Chapter 5, The Rise of Baron Vladimir, we'll meet the man who would become the most infamous ruler Giedi Prime ever produced, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, and trace how his particular genius for cruelty and cunning lifted House Harkonnen to the height of its power within the Imperium. There came, in the fullness of time, a single man in whom all the patience of his house found its final shape, and his name was Vladimir Harkonnen, and he was called Baron, and under his slow and heavy hand, the fortunes of his family would rise higher than they had risen in 10,000 years of waiting. He was born into a house that had already learned, across generation upon generation, that vengeance was not a thing to be seized in anger, but a thing to be grown, quietly, the way a vintner grows a wine in darkness, undisturbed, for decades, until at last it is ready to be poured. Vladimir Harkonnen was raised inside that patience, as a child is raised inside a house, without ever having to be told its walls were there, and he carried it inside him his whole long life, wearing it as easily as he wore his robes. He was, from his early years, a mind of unusual brightness, quick with numbers, quicker still with people, able to see in a single glance where another man's weakness lay, and how it might someday be made useful. This gift for seeing weakness was, perhaps, the truest inheritance of his line, sharpened now in him to something almost effortless, so that those who dealt with him often felt, only afterward, that they had given away more than they had meant to, and could not quite say when it had happened. He learned early that cruelty spoken loudly was cruelty wasted, that the far crueler thing was patience dressed as courtesy, an insult delivered so gently that the victim smiled through it before understanding what had been taken from him. This became his signature, the slow smile, the soft voice, the terrible arithmetic working always underneath. In body he grew, as the years passed, into something vast, for the Baron loved the pleasures of the table and the pleasures of indulgence generally, and did nothing at all to restrain his appetites, and so his flesh grew heavier with every passing year, until he had become, by the time this telling finds him, a man of such tremendous weight that his own legs could no longer easily carry him. And so it was that he took to wearing, beneath his robes, a harness of suspensors, small anti-gravity devices of the kind used elsewhere to lift great burdens. And these were fitted to his frame so that his monstrous bulk floated, weightless, wherever he willed it, and he could drift through his chambers like some vast, pale moon crossing a black sky, silent, unhurried, terrible in his slowness. It was said by those who served him that his very way of moving, that soft and drifting glide, unsettled men more than any charge or shout could have done, for it seemed to say that he need never hurry, that time itself waited upon him. He surrounded himself with pleasures of every kind, with wines brought from distant worlds, with rich foods prepared by cooks who understood that a mistake in his kitchen was not merely a professional failure, and with young men chosen for his private amusement. For the Baron's tastes ran in that direction, and he made no great effort to hide it within his own walls, though he understood well enough the uses of discretion beyond them. He surrounded himself, too, with cruelty as a kind of pleasure in itself, for he found a deep and abiding satisfaction in the suffering of those beneath him, not always because it served some larger purpose, but simply because it pleased him, the way another man might be pleased by music or by wine. And this appetite, like his appetite for food, he indulged without much restraint, so that his household came to understand that survival in his service meant never drawing his particular attention.
Yet it would be a grave mistake to imagine that the Baron was merely gluttonous, merely cruel, merely indulgent. For beneath all of that vast, soft flesh, there worked a mind of extraordinary discipline, one that never once forgot the long purpose of his house, which was to climb back to the heights from which the shame of Abelard had cast it down. He set himself, from the earliest days of his rule, to the quiet work of consolidation, gathering into his hands the scattered threads of Harkonnen wealth and influence that his forebears had spent generations weaving, and drawing them tight, and testing each one for strength, discarding what was weak, reinforcing what held promise. He understood, as few of his line before him had understood so completely, that power in the Imperium was built not from a single bold stroke, but from 10,000 small transactions, favors extended and favors called in, silences purchased, small mercies granted to men who would remember them, small punishments delivered to men who would remember those as well and tell others. He cultivated relationships with the great trading combine called Chome, understanding long before most of his rivals did that whoever held influence there held a hand upon the true wealth of the Imperium. Wealth measured not merely in Solaris, but in shares, in seats, in the slow accumulation of directorships that meant more in the end than any army. He cultivated, too, a patient correspondence with the imperial court itself, never presuming, never overreaching, offering always some small service, some piece of information, some quiet accommodation, so that over the years the name Harkonnen came to be associated in the mind of the Padishah Emperor not with the disgrace of Abelard, but with usefulness, with reliability, with a house that understood how to make itself convenient to those above it. This, more than any single act of daring, was the true genius of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, that he understood revenge as a project to be managed across a lifetime, and he managed it as a merchant manages a ledger,
with patience, with precision, and without ever once forgetting the sum owed. He did not do this work alone, for even so formidable a mind as his required instruments, hands to carry out designs too delicate or too dangerous for the Baron himself to touch directly. And so around him he gathered servants of particular and terrible use, men shaped and chosen for exactly the purposes he required of them. Among these servants, in the years that followed, none would prove more valuable nor more chilling in his usefulness than the strange and brilliant creature who served the Baron as his mentat, a human computer whose gifts had been twisted from their proper purpose into something the Baron found endlessly convenient. And it is to this figure, and to the cold calculations that passed behind his hooded eyes, that our story now gently turns. There was, too, a particular satisfaction the Baron took in the slow reversal of history itself, in the knowledge that the very court which had once stripped his ancestor Abelard of honor and title was now, decade by decade, coming to depend upon Harkonnen resources, Harkonnen silence, Harkonnen convenience, and every small favor granted to the throne felt to him like a single coin returned from a debt that had been owed for 10,000 years. He did not rush this feeling, did not allow it to spill over into any premature display of ambition, for he understood, as his forebears had understood before him, that a debt collected too soon is a debt collected poorly. And so he continued to smile, to accommodate, to make himself useful, all the while keeping a private ledger in his mind of every slight endured and every service rendered, waiting for the day when the balance might finally be called due in full. He governed his own household in this same spirit of patient calculation, rewarding loyalty with real and lasting benefit, for the Baron understood that fear alone, however useful in the moment, could never bind a servant as securely as fear joined to genuine hope of advancement. And so, those who served him well found themselves lifted, in small, steady increments, toward positions of greater comfort and greater trust, while those who served him poorly found the opposite, a slow and deliberate diminishment that left them, more often than not, grateful merely to have escaped worse. In this way, he built around himself, across the years of his rule, a household bound to him not merely by terror, but by the practical wisdom of self-interest. And this too was a kind of genius. For a house built only on fear collapses at the first sign of its master's weakness, while a house built on carefully managed hope endures a good while longer. And endurance, above all else, was the quality the Baron prized most highly in every design he made. Up next in Chapter 6, The Baron's Twisted Mentat, we'll follow Peter de Vries into the Baron's inner chambers and learn what the Tleilaxu had done to make a mind so brilliant serve a heart so cruel, and how his cold calculations would help set in motion a plot that would one day reach all the way to Arrakis. In the service of a house that measured its worth in patience and cruelty alike, there was need, sooner or later, for a mind that could see further and calculate more coldly than any ordinary servant. And so the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen came, in time, to keep at his side a mentat, one of those rare and disciplined humans trained across long years to perform the labors of logic and prediction that machines, forbidden across the Imperium since the ancient wars against thinking machines, could no longer be trusted to perform. A true mentat was meant to be a thing of great discipline and inner stillness, a mind cultivated toward clarity the way a garden is cultivated toward order, so that it might process vast webs of information and return, at the end of its quiet trance, an answer close to certainty. But the mentat who served the Baron was not, in his making, entirely of that gentler tradition. and his name was Peter de Vries. Peter had been shaped upon the twisted world of the Bene Tleilax, among that strange and secretive people who dealt in flesh the way other men dealt in metal or spice, reworking bodies, and sometimes minds, to specifications that suited whichever buyer could pay their price. And it was there that Peter's mentat training had been layered over with something else entirely, a conditioning toward cruelty, toward a taste for suffering, so that the same faculties that could trace the outcome of 1,000 possible futures could also, without the smallest hesitation, savor the particular anguish of a man being ruined.
He was, in the language sometimes used for such men, a twisted mentat. And this twisting was no accident of birth, but a deliberate refinement, purchased and paid for, because the Baron had wanted precisely this, a mind of the first rank, bent entirely to his purposes, unburdened by the moral restraints that might otherwise have slowed a more conventionally trained mentat's obedience. He was a man of unusual appearance, lean where the Baron was vast. His eyes touched faintly with the blue within blue that came from the excessive use of the spice melange, for Peiter consumed it in great quantities, both because his labors demanded the heightened awareness it lent to a trained mind, and because he had, in time, come simply to crave it, as a man craves any pleasure he has allowed to become a need. He moved through the Baron's fortress on Giedi Prime with a kind of theatrical grace, given to sudden laughter, to poetry recited at strange moments, to little cruelties of speech that amused him privately, even as they served the Baron's larger designs. And those who watched him closely sometimes wondered whether the performance of madness was itself a kind of mask, worn deliberately over a mind that remained, underneath it all, perfectly cold and perfectly calculating. It was Peiter who became, across the years of the Baron's long climb, the quiet architect of many of the house's most delicate maneuvers, for his was the mind that could hold in balance 1,000 shifting variables, the loyalties of minor nobles, the movements of chome directors, the private appetites of guild agents, the long memory of the Emperor's own suspicions, and weave from all of it a single thread of action that would move the Harkonnen fortunes forward, without ever once exposing the Baron's own hand to view. He calculated odds the way another man might breathe, without conscious effort, and he took a plain and undisguised pleasure in delivering his conclusions to the Baron in ways calculated to please a mind that loved cruelty as much as it loved cleverness, dressing his logic in flourishes of dark wit, so that the Baron came to depend upon him not only for his answers, but for the particular manner in which those answers arrived. Yet there was, in the arrangement between them, a coldness that ran in both directions, for the Baron trusted no one completely, understanding as he did that a mentat who could calculate so precisely the ruin of others could just as easily calculate his own. And he kept Peiter always a little hungry, a little uncertain of his footing, rewarding him with spice and with the occasional cruel indulgence, but never with true security. For the Baron understood that a servant who felt himself safe might grow careless in his loyalty, while a servant who felt himself always slightly at risk would sharpen his usefulness rather than dull it. Peiter, for his part, seemed to understand this arrangement, and even to enjoy it after his own fashion, for he was a creature who found a strange satisfaction in walking always along the edge of the Baron's patience, testing it with small insolences, retreating always just before the line was crossed, as though the game itself were a kind of pleasure indistinguishable, in his twisted nature, from the pleasure he took in his work. It was this same twisted mentat who would, in the fullness of time, help the Baron shape the long and patient scheme that reached toward Arrakis itself.
For it was Piter's calculating mind that helped weigh the timing of betrayals, the placement of traitors, the precise moment at which a trap, many years in the weaving, might finally be sprung upon House Atreides. And though the greater architecture of that plot belonged to minds above even the Baron's own, it was Piter who handled its finer details, its human variables, the small cruelties that would need to be arranged so that a larger cruelty might succeed. He took, in this work, an evident satisfaction that went beyond mere professional pride. For Piter de Vries loved best of all to see suffering that his own intellect had designed, and he would sit sometimes in quiet contemplation of plans not yet executed, turning them over as another man might turn over a fine gem, admiring the facets of pain he had cut into them. But even the finest instrument, however sharp, remains an instrument. And the Baron never once mistook Piter's brilliance for equality, keeping him always beneath him in the house's true order of authority, a tool sharpened and used, and, when the moment demanded it, set aside without sentiment. This was the nature of service within the House of Harkonnen, that even the most gifted among its servants existed finally to be spent in the service of the Baron's design. And Piter de Vries, for all his cleverness, would in time come to learn the truth of this in a manner more final than he might have calculated for himself. There was, however, another kind of instrument in the Baron's household, one built not of subtle calculation, but of raw and simple force. A nephew, grown large and brutal in body, as Piter was grown subtle in mind. And it was to this nephew, called by those who feared him the Beast, that the Baron would turn when Piter's delicate schemes required, at last, a heavier hand to carry them through to their conclusion. There was, in the long relationship between the Baron and his mentat, a strange intimacy that grew up alongside the coldness. For Piter alone among the Baron's servants was permitted to speak with a freedom that bordered on insolence, to offer his conclusions wrapped in jokes and verses that another master might have punished. And the Baron, rather than silencing this, seemed almost to encourage it. Perhaps because he recognized in Piter's performance a distorted mirror of his own delight in cruelty dressed as wit. Or perhaps simply because a mentat allowed some small freedom of expression calculated more freely than one kept in constant terror. And so the two of them settled into a rhythm that outward observers found difficult to read. The vast, drifting Baron and the lean, spice-eyed mentat, trading barbed pleasantries across the long tables of the fortress on Giedi Prime, even as they plotted, beneath those pleasantries, schemes that would in time bring ruin upon houses far away. Piter's gift for calculation extended even to the reading of men's hidden desires, and he took a professional pride in identifying within any rival or potential tool the exact lever that might be pressed to bend them toward Harkonnen purposes, whether that lever was greed or fear or love or some old wound never properly healed. And he catalogued these levers with the same careful attention a physician might give to symptoms, filing them away against the day they might prove useful. It was this same patient cataloging that made him so valuable in the years when the Baron's ambitions began to reach, at last, toward the greatest prize of all, the fief of Arrakis itself. For a plot of that size required the identification of 100 small weaknesses in 100 different men. And Piter de Vries, twisted though his gifts had been made, possessed exactly the cold and patient eye such a plot demanded. Up next in Chapter 7, Glossu Rabban, the Beast, will meet the Baron's elder nephew, a man built for brutality rather than cunning, and learn how his cruelty would be turned, quite deliberately, into an instrument of Harkonnen rule upon the sands of Arrakis. Within the great house of Harkonnen there grew, in time, 2 nephews of the Baron, sons of his own line brought up beneath his roof to be shaped into whatever use his long designs required of them. And the elder of these 2 was a man named Glossu Rabban, though those who came to know his methods in later years would call him, more often and more quietly, the Beast. And it is to him that this hour of our telling now turns, gently, as one turns toward a shadow simply to understand its shape before passing on. Glossu Rabban was built along different lines from his uncle, for where the Baron's power lay hidden beneath layers of soft flesh and softer speech, Rabban's power lay plainly upon the surface of him, in a heavy frame and a heavier hand, in a temperament that reached for force before it reached for thought, and in a mind that, whatever its native quickness might once have been, had been allowed across his upbringing to develop along the single narrow track of violence, so that by the time he was grown, he understood few other instruments for getting what he wanted. He was not a stupid man, in the sense of being unable to follow a plan laid before him, but he was a man without subtlety, without the patience that had carried his family across 10,000 years of waiting. And this the Baron understood clearly, and rather than lament it in his nephew, the Baron came to see in it a particular and considerable use. For the Baron reasoned, in the long, slow calculations that governed all his dealings, that a house cannot rule by gentleness alone, that somewhere in the great machinery of dominion there must exist an instrument of pure and unhesitating force, one that need not trouble itself with the finer questions of consequence or mercy. And Rabban, in his bluntness, in his appetite for cruelty, exercised without the elegant restraint that marked the Baron's own cruelties, was exactly such an instrument, ready-made, requiring only direction. And so it was that when the Harkonnens came at last into stewardship of the desert world called Arrakis, in that long interval before House Atreides was given the fief, and after the Harkonnens had first extracted its wealth for themselves, it was Rabban who was sent to govern it in his uncle's name. And it was Rabban's rule that the desert folk of that world, the Fremen who dwelt hidden in its deep places, would come to remember with a bitterness that outlasted his own life. Under Rabban's governance, the exactions laid upon the people of Arrakis grew harsh beyond even what the ordinary business of spice extraction required. For he taxed and he punished and he crushed resistance wherever he found it, or imagined he found it, with a heaviness of hand that made no distinction between the guilty and the merely unfortunate. And in this, he served his uncle's purposes exactly as intended. For the Baron had reasoned, in his patient and far-seeing way, that a population ground down long enough under one hand would come, eventually, to welcome almost any hand that lifted the weight even slightly. And so, Rabban's cruelty was never merely cruelty for its own sake in the Baron's larger design, however much Rabban himself might have enjoyed it as exactly that. He was, in this sense, both a genuine brute and a tool being wielded by a mind far more patient than his own. And it seems likely that Rabban himself, for all his native slyness in smaller matters, never fully grasped the larger shape of the role he was being made to play. He was feared, across the settlements and the spice camps of Arrakis, in the particular way that men fear and force without conscience. For there was no bargaining with Rabban, no appeal to reason or proportion that might soften his response to defiance, and the desert folk learned to move carefully in the season of his rule, to hide what could be hidden, to endure what could not be avoided, and to remember, in the long communal memory that such a people keep, exactly what had been done to them, and by whom. It was said of him that he took a plain, uncomplicated pleasure in domination, that he enjoyed the visible fact of another creature's fear more than he enjoyed any of the subtler pleasures his uncle prized. And this simplicity of appetite made him, in some ways, easier to read than the Baron, and yet no less dangerous for being easier to read. For a blunt instrument swung without restraint can still crush whatever lies beneath it. Between Raban and the Baron, there existed a relationship shaped entirely by use. For the Baron felt for his elder nephew little of what might be called affection, and made small effort to disguise this, treating Raban's usefulness as the whole of his value and reminding him of this in ways subtle and unsubtle whenever it suited his purposes to do so. Raban, for his part, seemed to accept this arrangement with a kind of dull loyalty, perhaps because he understood no other way of belonging to his house, perhaps because the rewards of obedience, the wealth and standing that came with his uncle's favor, outweighed whatever resentment he might otherwise have nursed. And so he served, faithfully in his rough fashion, carrying out the harshest portions of the Baron's design without ever quite grasping that his own harshness was itself being carefully spent, like a coin, toward an end he could not see. For even as Raban ground the population of Arrakis beneath his heel, the Baron was already looking beyond him, toward a second nephew, younger, quicker, altogether more dangerous in a way that Raban's raw force could never be. A nephew being groomed with far greater care to become, in time, the true face the Baron wished the Imperium and the people of Arrakis eventually to see. This younger nephew was named Feyd Rautha, and where Raban had been given the desert world to crush, Feyd Rautha was being prepared for something else entirely. Prepared to arrive, at the proper moment, as a kind of relief from Raban's cruelty, so that the suffering people beneath Harkonnen rule might come, however briefly, to feel something like gratitude toward the very house that had orchestrated their misery from the very beginning. Those who studied Raban closely, and there were some among the Baron's household who made a quiet study of such things, noted that his cruelty seemed to carry within it a kind of hunger that could never quite be satisfied, that each new act of harshness brought him only a brief and passing satisfaction, before the same restless appetite returned, seeking some fresh occasion for its expression. And this pattern, repeated across the years of his governance, left him a man increasingly isolated even among his own household, feared by those beneath him, and regarded with a certain wary distance even by those who served him directly, for none could ever be entirely certain what small provocation might draw his anger down upon them next. He surrounded himself, in time, with a retinue of officers who had learned to anticipate his moods and to carry out his harsher orders without requiring him to dirty his own hands more than he wished. And in this way, his rule over Arrakis took on a mechanical quality, cruelty administered almost as routine, almost as a kind of bureaucracy of suffering, which made it in some ways more terrible than a cruelty born of passion alone. For passion, at least, sometimes cools, while routine, once established, tends only to grind onward. The desert folk who endured this rule kept their own long memory of it, passing down among themselves the particular grievances of Raban's years, the confiscations and the executions, and the countless smaller humiliations that accumulate, over time, into something harder and more dangerous than any single act of cruelty could produce alone. A settled and patient hatred that would, in later years, find its expression in ways the Harkonnens themselves had never quite anticipated, though this part of the story belongs to a much later hour of our telling. For now, it is enough to understand that Raban's rule, however useful it seemed to the Baron in the moment, was also quietly gathering, beneath the sands of that harsh world, a debt of its own, one that would eventually come due in full, and paid to a different family than the one that had inflicted it. Up next, in Chapter 8, Feyd-Rautha, the groomed heir, will turn to the Baron's younger and favored nephew and learn how his charm and his cunning were being carefully shaped into the second half of a cruel and patient design, one in which Rabban's brutality was never meant to be the whole of the story, but only its harsher half. If Glossu Rabban was the Baron's blunt instrument, shaped for force and sent to rule where force alone was thought sufficient, then the Baron's younger nephew was something else again, something far more carefully made, and his name was Feyd-Rautha. And it is to the slow and deliberate grooming of this young man that our story now turns, quietly, as one turns the page of a long and patient plan. Feyd-Rautha was younger than Rabban, and from his earliest years the Baron watched him with an attention he had never quite given his elder nephew. For in Feyd-Rautha, the Baron saw qualities of his own making, a quickness of mind, a charm that came easily and could be turned on or withdrawn at will, an instinct for reading the temper of a room and bending it toward his own advantage, and above all, a hunger, carefully banked but never far from the surface, for power and for the pleasures that power brought with it. Where Rabban had been given over almost entirely to the cultivation of force, Feyd-Rautha was cultivated towards something more supple, a mind capable of cruelty, but also capable of concealment, a young man who could smile warmly at another, even while calculating behind that same smile the precise manner of that person's eventual downfall. The Baron understood, in the long architecture of his planning, that a house cannot rule by brutality alone forever, for brutality unrelieved breeds only a deeper and more dangerous hatred, one that, in time, must find its release. And so, alongside Rabban's harsh and open rule, the Baron had begun preparing, patiently, across years, a different kind of heir, one who might one day be presented to a suffering population not as another weight upon their backs, but as a kind of deliverance, a young lord whose arrival might be met, after Rabban's long cruelty, with something almost like relief, almost like hope, even though the deliverance offered would be no true deliverance at all, but merely the same house wearing a gentler mask. This was the design the Baron nursed for Feyd-Rautha from his earliest years, that he be trained to appear where Rabban had made himself feared, to appear generous where Rabban had been grasping, to appear, in short, as everything Rabban was not, while remaining underneath it all, every bit as ruthless, every bit as devoted to Harkonnen supremacy, only far better disguised. To this end, Feyd-Rautha was educated with great care in the arts that mattered most to his uncle's purposes, in the management of appearances, in the cultivation of loyalty among those he might someday need to command, in the subtler forms of cruelty that left no obvious mark and could be denied or excused, and in the physical disciplines that would let him present himself, when the moment demanded it, as a figure of martial glory as well as political cunning. He was trained, among other things, in the arts of personal combat, for it was the custom upon Giedi Prime to test young men of ambition in blood sport, and Feyd-Rautha was made to excel in this arena as in all others, appearing before the gathered watchers of his homeworld as a figure of danger and glamour both. A young man whose skill in the killing ring won him a kind of popular admiration that Rabban, for all his power, had never been able to command. For the people who feared Raban's cruelty found something to cheer in Feyd-Rautha's grace, not yet understanding how carefully that grace had been arranged for exactly this effect.
The Baron watched all of this with the particular satisfaction of a craftsman observing his own careful work bear fruit. And yet, even in his favor toward Feyd-Rautha, he permitted himself no illusions of simple affection. For the Baron trusted no one entirely, not even the nephew he had chosen to elevate above all others. And he understood well enough that a young man raised to hunger for power might, in time, hunger for it a little too soon, might begin to calculate not only the downfall of his family's enemies, but the downfall of his own uncle as well. And so the Baron kept Feyd-Rautha's ambitions carefully bridled, even as he cultivated them, granting him just enough scope to grow strong, and just enough restraint to keep him, for the present, obedient. Feyd-Rautha, for his part, was neither foolish nor blind to the game being played around him, and he learned in his own turn to play a longer game of his own, waiting with a patience that would have startled those who saw only his public charm, understanding as clearly as his uncle did that a house built on 10,000 years of grievance rewarded above all else the virtue of waiting. And so he waited, cultivating his own following quietly among the household guard and among certain favored servants, building loyalties that were his alone and not merely borrowed from his uncle's authority, so that when his moment eventually came, he might rise upon a foundation that was, in some part at least, entirely his own making. It was understood, though never spoken aloud in so many words within the household, that Feyd-Rautha was being prepared to inherit the barony itself when the time at last arrived, that Raban's harsher rule was merely a preparation, a softening of the ground, an ugliness against which Feyd-Rautha's eventual ascension might shine by contrast. And this design, cold and calculating as it was, revealed once again the essential character of House Harkonnen, that even its own heirs were instruments in a larger design, valued not for themselves, but for the particular use their particular nature could serve. One nephew shaped for brutality, the other shaped for charm, both of them, in their different ways, extensions of the Baron's own long and patient cruelty. And so the house prepared itself across these years, with Raban's rule already darkening one distant world, and Feyd-Rautha waiting in the wings of Giedi Prime for the moment his uncle would judge him ready. While all the while, the greater fortunes of the family continued to grow, through channels far less visible than either nephew's ambitions, through the vast and quiet workings of trade and wealth that bound the Harkonnen name ever more tightly into the deep economic sinews of the Imperium itself. Sinews that ran, above all, through the golden thread of the spice, and through the great combine that governed its movement across the stars. The Baron watched this quiet accumulation of personal loyalty with a careful and divided attention, for even as he approved of the ambition it revealed, recognizing in it the same hunger for advantage that had carried his own line forward across 10,000 years, he never once relaxed his own vigilance where Feyd-Rautha was concerned, and he arranged, in ways his nephew did not always perceive, small tests of loyalty, disguised as ordinary requests, small temptations laid before him to see whether the young man's discretion would hold under strain. Feyd-Rautha, for his part, seemed to sense something of this testing, and he met it with the same careful patience his uncle prized above all things, giving away nothing of his true ambitions before the moment was ripe, understanding instinctively that a young man who reveals his hand too early in a house such as this one rarely lives to play the hand at all. It was in the great arena of Giedi Prime, before crowds gathered to watch the blood sport that formed so central a part of that world's culture, that Feyd-Rautha's carefully cultivated public image found its truest expression. For there he appeared not as a schemer, but as a figure of glamour and daring, graceful in the killing ring, in a manner calculated to leave a lasting impression upon all who watched. And the Baron,
observing these performances from his private box, understood their value precisely, recognizing that a population which admired its ruler even a little required far less coercion than one which merely feared him, and that Feyd-Rautha's growing popularity among the common folk of Giedi Prime was itself a form of wealth, quieter than Solaris, but no less real. One more thread in the great and patient design the Baron had spent his whole life weaving.
Up next, in Chapter 9, Spice, Chome, and the Web of Wealth. We'll follow the quiet threads of Harkonnen fortune as they wind through the melange trade and the great trading combine called Chome, and see how wealth, patiently gathered, became the true and lasting foundation of the Baron's growing power. Long before the name Atreides had ever touched the sand of Arrakis, the House of Harkonnen sat upon that dune-swept planet like a patient spider at the center of a web spun from spice and silence. And if you let your breathing slow now, we can drift together through those long, quiet decades of hidden wealth. Decades that asked for no witnesses and left behind no monuments, only ledgers and vaults, and the low hum of profit accumulating in the dark. For 80 years, by the old reckoning, House Harkonnen held the planetary fief of Arrakis as its private concession, granted by an imperium that cared only that the melange kept flowing outward to the waiting galaxy. And in all that long stretch of time, the Harkonnen never once forgot that the true treasure beneath their boots was not a substance to be mined and shipped and sold in the ordinary way of trade, but something closer to a secret to be rationed out, drop by careful drop, into a universe that could not survive without it. You may already know the Geld truths of melange, how it eased the folding of space for the Guild's navigators, how it lit something quiet and eternal behind the eyes of those who used it long enough, how it kept the frail human body supple against the slow erosion of years. And knowing this, you can understand why the Baron and his forefathers before him treated Arrakis not as a burden to be endured, but as a throne room disguised as a wasteland, a place where the sand itself paid tribute. Under Harkonnen stewardship, the harvesting of spice became a quiet art of extraction. Crawlers groaning out across the open erg under the watchful eyes of ornithopters. And always, the calculation of profit weighed heavier than the calculation of mercy, so that laborers were spent as easily as fuel, and workers moving across the desert were, in the eyes of the Harkonnen ledgers, simply another cost to be minimized rather than a people to be protected. Let this settle over you slowly, the way sand settles after a long wind, not as violence, but as arithmetic, the plain and terrible arithmetic of an empire built on counting. And beneath the counting, hidden from the eyes of the emperor himself, from the eyes of the Landsrat, from the eyes of the great trading combine called Chome, which nominally oversaw every ounce of spice moving through the galaxy, the Harkonnen kept caches, deep vaults sunk into stone and hidden beneath false readings. Spice reserves accumulated across generations and never declared. A private fortune folded quietly into the family's coffers, so that when the moment came, whenever it might come, the Harkonnen would never be as poor as their books suggested. This is the shape of an old and careful greed, patient enough to wait a lifetime, patient enough to let its hoard simply exist, unspoken, beneath the notice of every authority meant to police it. And you should understand, drifting here in the dark, that Chome itself, the combine Onet Ober Advancer Mercantiles, was never a simple accounting house, but a vast lattice of shares and directorships in which the great houses of the Landsrat and the Emperor's own person held stakes measured in fractions of fractions.
so that whoever controlled the flow of spice from Arrakis controlled, in some deep and structural way, the wealth of nearly everyone who mattered in the whole of civilization. The Harkonnen, holding the fief for so long, learned to manipulate this lattice the way a puppeteer learns the weight of every string, adjusting yields upward or downward, not for the good of the market, but for the good of House Harkonnen alone. Starving supply here to raise a price there, feeding a surplus into one sector to smother a rival's profit in another, and doing all of this behind a mask of bureaucratic normalcy that no outside auditor ever quite managed to see through.
It is worth pausing here, in this soft and sleepy hour, to notice how much of the old Harkonnen power was built not from swords, but from numbers, not from armies alone, but from the quiet manipulation of contracts, futures, and shares. A kind of war fought entirely in ledgers, where the wounded never bled, and the dead were only entries removed from a page. The wealth that accumulated across these 80 years was staggering even by imperial standards. Solaris beyond counting, enough to fund private armies of Sardaukar-trained mercenaries, enough to bribe entire strata of imperial bureaucracy, enough to purchase silence from CHOAM directors who might otherwise have asked uncomfortable questions about vanished shipments and quietly falsified export tallies. And so the Harkonnen grew rich in the way that old poisons grow potent, slowly, invisibly, gathering strength in the dark until the moment they are finally poured out. When at last, after decades of this quiet harvest, the imperial throne under Shaddam IV's predecessors began to reconsider the wisdom of leaving so vast a treasure in the hands of a single house indefinitely, whispers began to move through the Landsraad that the Harkonnen fief might not be permanent after all, that stewardship of Arrakis was, by its ancient charter, always subject to imperial reassignment should the throne judge it wise. You can imagine, if you like, how such a rumor would have settled over the Baron and his forebears like a slow chill. Not panic, for the Harkonnen were never a house given to panic, but a cold and calculating recalculation of how the family's fortune might be preserved, even if the fief itself were one day stripped away. It was in this long shadow of uncertainty that the hidden vaults grew even more essential. Insurance against a future in which the official spice concession might belong to someone else entirely. Insurance built from decades of quiet skimming that no accounting of the official record could ever fully reveal. And it was in this same shadow that the Baron who would one day be remembered above all others, Vladimir Harkonnen, began to understand a lesson his ancestors had only half learned. That wealth, without the Emperor's personal favor, was a fortress built on sand, however deep its foundations, and that the family's long future would depend not merely on spice hoarded in the dark, but on alliances forged in secret with the very throne that might otherwise take everything away. Let that thought rest here for a moment, quiet and unhurried. The seed of everything that would follow. The slow turning of a wheel that had already been turning for centuries. Spice becoming gold. Gold becoming influence. Influence becoming, at last, a private understanding between a baron and an emperor that neither dared commit to any public page. Up next, in Chapter 10, The Emperor's Secret Bargain, we'll follow that quiet understanding into the shadowed halls of Kaitain itself, where a nervous and ambitious emperor begins to see in Baron Harkonnen the one instrument sharp enough and secret enough to remove a rival he could never move against in the open light of the Landsraad.
let your mind drift now toward Kaitane, the golden capital of the Padishah Empire, where beneath all the polish and ceremony, a nervous man sat upon the lion throne, Shaddam IV, an emperor who had learned, as all emperors eventually learn, that the greatest threats to a throne rarely come from open rebellion, but from quiet popularity growing somewhere just beyond the palace walls. And you should understand, resting easy as we move through this part of the long story, that the man who worried Shaddam most in all the wide Imperium was not a warlord or a pretender, but a duke, Leto Atreides of Caladan, a nobleman whose charm and honor and battle skill had begun to draw the eyes of the Landsraad in a way that made the Emperor's own advisors murmur, of a duke who might, in time, gather enough support among the great houses to challenge the throne itself. Not through treason, for Leto was too honorable for that, but through the slower and more dangerous treason of simply being loved. This is the quiet fear that moves through this chapter. Not a fear of swords, but a fear of admiration. The way a flame fears not the wind that fights it, but the wind that simply starves it of air. Shaddam, watching Duke Leto's household troops train to a standard nearly equal to his own Sardaukar legions, watching the Duke's popularity swell among houses that might otherwise have remained neutral or hostile toward one another, understood that a Duke so respected, so capable, so quietly magnetic, could one day assemble around himself the very coalition that might unseat an emperor from his throne. And so Shaddam decided, in the cold and private arithmetic that all rulers eventually learn, that Leto Atreides must be removed, and removed in such a way that no fingerprint of the imperial hand could ever be found upon the deed. It is here, drifting gently through this part of the tale, that Baron Vladimir Harkonnen enters the Emperor's calculations. For the ancient feud between House Harkonnen and House Atreides was known throughout the Imperium, a rivalry old enough that no one alive could say with certainty where it had first begun. And Shaddam understood that a baron already burning with generations of inherited hatred toward the Atreides would need very little persuasion to become the blade that struck the killing blow. So long as the baron was given the resources and, more importantly, the permission to strike without fear of imperial reprisal. And so, in chambers sealed against listening devices, in conversations carried by trusted intermediaries rather than committed to any written record, an understanding began to form between the throne and the baron. An understanding built not on friendship, for neither man trusted the other even slightly, but on the cold recognition that their interests, for this one terrible purpose, ran perfectly parallel. Let yourself settle deeper here, because what follows is the heart of the secret bargain, the quiet mechanism by which an emperor could destroy a beloved duke without ever appearing to lift a hand against him. Shaddam agreed to lend the baron a portion of his own Sardaukar, those terrible soldiers trained from childhood on the brutal world of Seleucia Secundus, warriors whose skill in battle was without equal anywhere in the civilized galaxy. And these Sardaukar would be disguised, dressed in the black and red livery of House Harkonnen, folded quietly into the baron's own forces, so that to any outside observer, to any investigator the Landsraad might eventually send, the annihilation of House Atreides would appear to be nothing more than an old feud, finally reaching its bloody conclusion. A private war between two houses, rather than an act of imperial treachery. This is the shape of the bargain,
and if you listen closely, you can hear how carefully it was built to leave no trace. For the great convention that governed warfare among the houses of the Landsraad forbade the emperor from using his own troops against a duke without cause and without the sanction of the Landsraad itself. And so the disguise was not merely tactical, but legal, a shield of appearances behind which the emperor could commit an act that would otherwise have shattered the fragile peace holding the Imperium together. The Baron, for his part, understood exactly what he was being offered. Not merely soldiers, but impunity. The quiet assurance that whatever horror he chose to visit upon the Atreides would never be traced back to Khitan. And in exchange, he offered the Emperor something Shaddam wanted almost as desperately as Leto's removal: a return of the melange concession on Arrakis to more profitable and more pliable hands. Hands that would not ask uncomfortable questions about where all the wealth was truly going. It is worth resting a moment here, in the soft dark of this thought, to notice how thoroughly business and vengeance had become intertwined in this arrangement. How the personal hatred the Baron carried for House Atreides folded seamlessly into the larger machinery of imperial economics, spice and blood moving together down the same quiet channel. And so the pieces began to move, slowly, the way pieces always move before the true storm arrives. Duke Leto Atreides was granted, by imperial decree, the very fief the Harkonnen had held for 80 years. The planet Arrakis itself. A gift that glittered on the surface with the promise of unimaginable wealth and prestige, and that concealed beneath its glittering surface a trap built jointly by an emperor's fear and a baron's ancient hatred, its jaws already oiled and waiting. Duke Leto, for all his wisdom, for all the counsel of his most trusted advisors, understood something of the danger even as he accepted the fief. For a gift offered so suddenly and so generously by an emperor who had never favored his house before could hardly be anything but a poisoned one. And yet, the codes of honor and obligation that bound the great houses to the Imperium left him little true choice but to accept what the throne commanded him to take. Let this rest quietly with you now. The picture of two old and patient predators, an emperor cloaked in golden ceremony and a baron cloaked in generations of grievance, joining their hands together in the dark to bring down a man whose only true crime was being too honorable, too capable, and too well loved. Up next, in Chapter 11, The Trap Called Arrakis, we'll follow Duke Leto and his household as they journey toward that harsh and beautiful desert world, carrying with them a sense of quiet unease, even as the Harkonnen, retreating with practiced grace, leave behind them a planet seeded with traps no honest eye could yet see. Picture now, if you will, in this slow and drifting hour, the great migration of House Atreides across the wide dark of space. Ships carrying Duke Leto, his concubine, Lady Jessica, his young son, Paul, and the whole retinue of retainers, soldiers, and household staff that made up the living body of a great house, all of them moving steadily toward a planet that most of the Imperium knew only by its harshness. Arrakis, the desert world, Dune, a place of sand without end and heat without mercy, and yet also the only place in the known universe where the spice melange could be found. And you should understand, resting easy as this chapter unfolds, that Duke Leto knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who has lived long enough among schemers to recognize a trap even when he cannot see its exact shape, that this gift of Arrakis was no true gift at all, but a maneuver,
a positioning of his house onto ground not of his choosing, ground the Harkonnen had occupied and studied and shaped to their own advantage for 80 long years. He understood, too, that refusal was never truly an option, for the codes that bound the great houses to the Imperium left him no path except acceptance. And so he moved forward, not out of blindness, but out of the same careful courage that had made him beloved across the Landsraad, walking deliberately into danger because the alternative, defiance of the Imperial command, would have meant a swifter and more certain destruction. Let your breathing slow further as we consider what the Harkonnen left behind them on that desert world. For the retreat of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen's forces from Arrakis was staged with the same patient artistry that had marked every other Harkonnen maneuver across the centuries. An appearance of grudging withdrawal that concealed, beneath its surface, a landscape deliberately seeded with weaknesses meant to be exploited the moment the true attack began. The city of Arrakeen, which would become the seat of Atreides' power on the planet, had been the old Harkonnen capital, and its very foundations, its water systems, its defenses, all of it had been shaped across generations by hands that now intended to use that intimate knowledge against the very people who would come to trust its walls. This is the quiet cruelty at the center of this chapter, not a cruelty of open violence, but a cruelty of design. A planet handed over looking like an opportunity, while secretly functioning as a stage set for annihilation. Duke Leto, wise enough to sense danger even where he could not see its precise mechanism, brought with him to Arrakis his most trusted advisors, among them Thufir Hawat, master of assassins and a mentat whose mind could turn raw information into strategy the way other men turned grain into bread, and Duncan Idaho, a swordmaster of unmatched loyalty, and Gurney Halleck, a warrior troubadour whose devotion to House Atreides ran as deep as blood. Around this small circle of loyal men, Leto hoped to build a defense strong enough to weather whatever the Harkonnen might attempt, and indeed his household moved with the discipline of men who understood they were walking into a contest of wits and daggers rather than open battle. And yet, drifting here in this soft dark, you should know that the trap being prepared against House Atreides was layered far more deeply than mere terrain or old fortifications. For Baron Harkonnen understood, as all the great schemers of this long story understood, that the surest way to destroy a fortress is not to batter down its walls, but to corrupt something trusted within them. Even as Duke Leto settled his household into Arrakeen, even as he began the careful work of winning the loyalty of the planet's native people, the Fremen, whose knowledge of the deep desert and its terrible sandworms made them a potential ally of extraordinary value, the Baron's true weapon was already moving quietly into position, a weapon far more devastating than any army of soldiers, because it wore a familiar and trusted face. Let this thought settle over you gently, the way a held breath finally releases. For the Harkonnen understood something that so many conquerors before them had forgotten, that the strongest walls in the universe cannot protect a house from the man already inside it, a man who has been given every reason to trust and every reason to be trusted in return. The spice production of Arrakis, meanwhile, the great and terrible engine of wealth that had made the Harkonnen rich beyond counting, continued as Duke Leto took formal control. Though he found, as he examined the ledgers and the harvesting operations left behind, signs everywhere of a deliberate sabotage. Spice production numbers falsified, equipment left in states of disrepair calculated to cost the Atreides dearly in the crucial early months of their stewardship, and workers whose loyalties had been carefully cultivated by Harkonnen agents, left behind specifically to whisper doubt and discontent into Atreides' ears. All of this Leto absorbed with the calm patience of a man who had long understood that ruling a planet meant enduring 1,000 small wounds before the true blow ever arrived. And he set himself and his most trusted men to the slow work of repair, of building trust with the Fremen, of restoring what sabotage had broken, never quite suspecting that the deepest wound of all had already been prepared, waiting only for its appointed hour, hidden not in the sand outside the walls of Arrakeen, but within the walls themselves, in the quiet devotion of a man Leto trusted as he trusted almost no one else in the galaxy. Rest here a moment, in this slow unfolding, and let yourself feel the shape of the trap closing, not with noise, not with violence, but with the patient, silent turning of a key already fitted long ago into a lock no one thought to examine. Up next, in Chapter 12, The Traitor Within the Walls, we'll follow the quiet unraveling of Dr. Wellington Yueh, the most trusted physician in the Atreides household, a good man bent by an old and terrible love into becoming the very instrument of his own duke's destruction. Let your thoughts settle now on a single, quiet man moving through the halls of Arrakeen. Dr. Wellington Yueh, a physician of the Suk school, a medical order so trusted throughout the Imperium that its graduates were conditioned, through processes deep and near sacred, to hold the lives of their patients as inviolable as their own, marked always by the small diamond tattoo upon the forehead that told the entire galaxy this was a healer who could never, under any circumstance, be turned against the one he served. And you should understand, drifting easy through this part of the story, that this near-mythical trust was precisely why Dr. Yueh had been chosen so long ago, not by Duke Leto, who genuinely believed in the man's unshakable loyalty, but by Baron Vladimir Harkonnen and his agents, who had studied the Suk conditioning for years and discovered, in their patient and terrible way, that even a bond thought to be beyond breaking could be broken if only the right lever were found and pressed with sufficient cruelty. That lever was love, the plainest and oldest of human vulnerabilities. For Dr. Yueh had a wife, Wanna, a woman he loved with the quiet totality that some men reserve for only one person in an entire lifetime. And Wanna had fallen, through circumstances the Harkonnen had engineered or exploited with great patience, into the hands of the Baron himself, held somewhere unseen, her fate entirely at the mercy of a man who understood precisely how to use another person's devotion as a weapon. Let this rest with you gently, because there is no cruelty in this long history quite so intimate as this one. For the Baron did not need to torture Yueh directly, did not need to threaten him with blades or with pain. He needed only to make it known, through whispers and through carefully delivered proof, that Wanna yet lived, that her continued survival depended entirely upon Yueh's cooperation, and that this cooperation would require the Doctor to betray the very man he had sworn, in the deepest conditioning of his order, never to harm. This is the shape of the trap that closes now around Duke Leto. Not a trap of swords or armies, but a trap built from the oldest material in the universe, a devoted heart made to choose between two loves it could not reconcile. The love of a wife whose life hung by a thread, and the loyalty owed to a duke who had never given Yueh any reason for anything but trust. And so, in the quiet hours of the Atreides household on Arrakis, Dr. Yueh moved through his daily duties as he always had,
tending to the health of the Duke and his household, offering counsel and comfort, all the while carrying within him a decision already made, a betrayal already planned. Though every outward gesture remained gentle and familiar, for that is the particular horror of this part of the story. That treachery here wore the softest and most trusted of faces. Let yourself breathe slowly as we come to the mechanism of the betrayal itself. For Dr. Yui's role was to disable the household shields, the personal defensive fields that protected Duke Leto and his people from blade and blast alike. At the precise moment, the Harkonnen forces, moving under cover of night and disguised as they had been arranged, with the Emperor's own hidden Sardaukar folded quietly among them, descended upon Arrakeen to begin the true and long-planned assault. Without the shields, without the fundamental protection that had made Atreides' soldiers confident in facing any conventional attack, the household would fall not through a failure of courage or skill, but through a single silent act performed by the one man no one thought to suspect.
And you should know, resting here, in this slow unfolding, that Dr. Yue did not act without conscience, did not betray his Duke without an agony of guilt pressing against every hour of his final days in the Atreides household. For he understood with terrible clarity what his actions would cost, and in the quiet architecture of his own broken heart he built, alongside his betrayal, a single small act of resistance. A hidden tooth, a poison capsule fitted secretly into Duke Leto's own mouth during what would be represented as ordinary medical care. A device meant to be triggered later, in proximity to the Baron himself, so that even in the moment of his own destruction, Leto might carry with him one final chance at vengeance. A chance Yue alone could offer, as some small penance for the treachery he could not avoid. Let this settle over you now. The terrible duality of a man who betrayed his master completely, and yet tried, in the same breath, to arm that master with a final weapon against the very forces commanding the betrayal. A contradiction that tells you something true about how even the most broken loyalty can leave behind fragments of its former shape. As the night deepened over Arrakeen, as the household settled into what should have been ordinary rest, Dr. Yue moved quietly to the mechanisms that governed the shield generators protecting the Duke's residence, and with hands that must have trembled even as his face remained composed, he did what the Baron had demanded of him, opening the household to an attack it could no longer repel, an attack already gathering in the dark beyond the walls. Harkonnen troops and disguised Sardaukar alike, moving forward under a night sky that gave no warning of what was about to fall upon the sleeping city. Rest here a while longer, in the last quiet moment before the storm breaks, and know that everything the Harkonnen had built across 10,000 years of patient cruelty, every hidden vault of spice, every secret bargain struck in golden chambers, every soldier disguised in borrowed colors, all of it had been leading toward this single, silent turning of a key inside the walls of a home that trusted the man who turned it. Up next, in Chapter 13, The Fall of House Atreides, we'll follow the night itself as it finally arrives, the shields falling silent, the desert dark filling with soldiers who should not have been there, and a great and honorable house brought down not by strength of arms, but by the long, cold patience of an enemy who had been waiting for this moment since long before Duke Leto ever set foot upon the sand. The night the trap closed on House Atreides began quietly, the way all great catastrophes begin, with the ordinary sounds of an evening on a strange planet,
slowly giving way to something else entirely. Arrakeen lay under its dark sky. The great house of the Duke settled into what its people still believed was merely a difficult new posting, a dangerous assignment among dangerous people, and nothing more. But far above the atmosphere, and far below the surface of every arrangement the Duke Leto Atreides had trusted, the Harkonnens and their allies were already moving, and the treachery that would end a great house had already begun to close around him, like a hand closing slowly around a candle flame. The plan had been built with patience across many months, the kind of patience only the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen could summon when the prize was large enough. An entire legion of Sardaukar, the Emperor's own terrible soldiers, had been smuggled onto Arrakis, disguised in Harkonnen uniforms, hidden in plain sight among troops the Duke's people had grown almost used to seeing in the distance. The Emperor Shaddam IV had lent his most feared soldiers to this quiet war precisely because he could never be seen to have lent them at all. And the Baron, who understood better than almost anyone alive how to use another man's fear and vanity against him, had arranged every piece so that the blame would fall only upon House Harkonnen. An old feud settling an old score. Nothing more than that, at least as far as the wider Imperium would ever be permitted to know. And so, in the deep hours of night, the assault came down upon Arrakeen like a hand closing over a sleeping city. Ships that should not have been able to reach the planet at all descended through skies the Duke's men had thought guarded, and soldiers who should not have been present at all began pouring into the streets and the palace grounds with the terrible efficiency of men who had trained their whole lives for exactly this kind of work. The household troops of Atreides, loyal and brave and hopelessly outnumbered, fought where they could and fell where they had to. And the golden lion banners that had flown so proudly over the palace only days before were trampled now beneath boots that did not care whose land this once had been. Inside the walls, confusion and fire spread together, and the Duke Leto Atreides, a man who had always tried to rule with honor even when honor cost him dearly, found himself moving through his own home as it came apart around him, giving what orders he still could, doing what any commander does when the battle is already lost, and only the manner of the losing remains to be decided. He had been betrayed, though he did not yet know by whom, and the betrayal ran deeper than any simple opening of a gate, deeper than any single failure of vigilance, for it had been planted inside his own household long before the first Sardaukar boot ever touched the sand. By the time the fighting quieted, the Duke had been taken. He was brought, bound and stripped of his weapons, into the presence of the man who had orchestrated his ruin. And there, in a captured room within his own palace, the Duke Leto Atreides looked upon the enormous, suspended shape of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen for what would be among the last times in his life. The Baron did not hide his pleasure. He floated in the room on his suspensor field, his great weight held aloft by the devices strapped beneath his robes, and he studied his old enemy with the slow, satisfied gaze of a man who has waited an entire lifetime for this single hour to finally arrive. Decades of feuding, generations of insult and injury passed down between the two houses like a poisoned inheritance. All of it seemed, in that moment, to be settling at last into the Baron's favor, and he did not trouble himself to hide how thoroughly he savored it. But the Duke Leto Atreides had not gone into that captured room entirely without a weapon of his own. Weeks before, in preparation for the danger he had felt gathering around him, even without knowing its exact shape, he had allowed his personal Suk doctor, a man named Wellington Yue, to replace one of his teeth with a false one, a tooth of gas, built to be released only by a sharp bite
at the moment the Duke chose, filling the air around him with a poison that would take anyone breathing it down into death alongside him. It was a small and terrible insurance, the last defiance of a man who understood he might not survive what was coming, but who intended, if he could manage nothing else, to make his death cost his enemies something they would remember. In that final room, surrounded by the men who had destroyed his house, the Duke bit down. The gas hissed outward, invisible and swift, and for one instant, it seemed as though justice, however small and however late, might yet be served upon the Baron who had orchestrated so much suffering. But the Baron survived, whether by fortune, by the quickness of his men, or by some precaution taken in advance. The poison did not find him, and instead, it found Peter de Vries, the Baron's own twisted mentat, the cunning and treacherous advisor who had helped design the very plot now closing around the Duke.
Peter, who had schemed and calculated and betrayed his way through every plan the Baron had ever asked of him, breathed in death meant for another man, and fell in the same room where he had helped orchestrate a duke's ruin. A fitting and quiet irony that the Baron would later recall with something close to amusement once the shock of the moment had passed. The Duke Leto Atreides did not long survive that final act of defiance. Weakened, betrayed, and already failing, he died in the aftermath, and with him died, for a time, the visible hope of House Atreides ever rising again. Word spread quickly across the Harkonnen forces, and in time across the wider Imperium, that the Duke was dead, that his household had been broken, and that his concubine Jessica and his young son Paul, the boy who might have carried the Atreides name forward, had perished as well, lost somewhere out in the vast and merciless desert where no one survived for long without shelter, without water, without the mercy that Arrakis never offered to anyone. The Baron received this news with the deep, unhurried satisfaction of a man who believed his oldest enemy had finally been erased from the universe entirely, root and branch, name and blood, gone as though he had never existed at all. It seemed, in that quiet hour, that the long feud between the two houses had at last been settled, and settled in the Baron's favor completely. He allowed himself to rest in that belief, to let it settle over him like a warm and comfortable blanket, never once suspecting how mistaken he truly was, never once imagining that the desert he trusted to finish what his soldiers had started might instead be quietly, secretly, keeping something alive. In the days that followed, as the Baron's forces consolidated their hold over Arrakeen and the surrounding territories, the Baron himself found reason to reflect, slowly and at length, upon the long road that had brought him to this single, triumphant night. It had cost him a great deal of gold, patient years of arranging alliances that meant nothing to him beyond their usefulness, and the quiet, careful cultivation of an emperor's fear and greed in equal measure. But he judged, sitting heavily in his private chambers with the reports of victory arriving one after another, that every coin and every year had been worth spending. The Atreides had been a thorn lodged deep in the side of his house, for longer than most men now living could properly remember. A family whose honor and popularity among the other great houses had always stood in humiliating contrast to the fear and contempt that so often greeted the Harkonnen name. And now, at last, that thorn had been drawn out and cast aside. He allowed himself, in that quiet hour, to think back upon Duke Leto's father, and upon the long chain of insults and injuries that had passed between their two houses since the ancient disgrace at the Battle of Corrin, a disgrace that had cost his own ancestors their titles and their standing, and had left the Harkonnen name marked for 10,000 years, with a shame that money alone had never been able to fully erase. Tonight, he told himself, some portion of that ancient debt had finally been repaid. Not through the slow accumulation of wealth or the careful rebuilding of standing among the great houses, but through the swift and total destruction of the very family that had, across so many generations, benefited most directly from the Harkonnens' long disgrace. Peter de Vries was buried, or perhaps simply discarded, with none of the ceremony a mentat of his cunning might otherwise have expected. For the Baron had little patience for mourning a servant, however clever, once that servant's usefulness had ended in so inconvenient a fashion. He had, after all, other men who could calculate and scheme in Peter's place, and he did not intend to let the death of one mentat, even one poisoned in his own stead, slow the momentum of a victory this complete. Word was sent outward across the Imperium, through channels both open and hidden, confirming to the other great houses and to the Emperor's own court that House Atreides had fallen, that its duke was dead, and that the dangerous popularity Leto had cultivated among the Landsraad had died along with him in the sands of a planet that had never truly welcomed him.
Yet, even as the Baron settled into the comfortable certainty of total victory, there remained, unspoken and largely unexamined, a small and nagging absence at the center of his triumph. For no body of the boy, Paul, had ever actually been recovered, nor any body of the Lady Jessica. And though the desert of Arrakis was cruel enough that few doubted its verdict, the Baron's own long experience with treachery and survival might have counseled him toward greater caution had his satisfaction not been so complete. He chose, as men often choose in the flush of victory, to believe what was most convenient to believe. And he turned his attention instead toward the far more immediate and practical question of who should now govern the planet in his family's name. Up next, in Chapter 14, The Beast's Reign of Terror. We'll follow Rabban as he is placed over a broken Arrakis, and we'll see the harsh and hungry rule he brings down upon its people. A cruelty with a purpose the Baron has not yet chosen to explain to him. With House Atreides believed destroyed, and Arrakis once again fully in Harkonnen hands, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen turned his attention to the question of who should govern the planet in his name. And the answer, as it so often was in matters requiring brute force rather than subtlety, was his nephew, Glossu Rabban. Rabban was installed as Siradar governor of Arrakis, given command over its cities, its garrisons, and its people, and told, in terms that left little room for gentleness, that he was to press the planet as hard as it could be pressed, to extract every measure of profit and obedience the desert would yield, and to do it without concern for how deeply the people beneath him came to hate him for it. This cruelty, though it looked to Rabban like nothing more than his own natural inclination finally given free rein, was in truth part of a longer and more calculated design that the Baron kept mostly to himself. The plan was simple in its cold logic, though monstrous in its human cost. Rabban would be allowed, even encouraged, to rule as harshly as his temperament desired, squeezing the population of Arrakis for every gram of spice and every measure of water that could be pulled from them, until the people had come to associate the very name of Harkonnen with hunger, with fear, and with the crushing weight of an occupier who cared nothing for their suffering. Then, once that hatred had been allowed to ripen fully, the Baron intended to withdraw Rabban and install his other nephew, the beautiful and cunning Thade Rotha, in his place, so that Thade might appear before the exhausted population of Arrakis as a merciful liberator,
a relief after years of brutality, and thereby win a loyalty that force alone could never have purchased. Rabban, of course, was never told any of this. He believed his cruelty was simply cruelty, an expression of his own appetite for dominance, and he set about his governorship with an eagerness that made the Baron's unspoken plan almost effortless to carry out. Under Rabban's rule, the machinery of Arrakis was turned entirely toward extraction and punishment. Spice quotas were set at levels the planet's laborers could barely meet, even under ideal conditions. And when the quotas were not met, the punishments that followed were swift and merciless, falling not only upon those responsible for the shortfall, but often upon entire villages and settlements whose only crime had been to exist within reach of Rabban's soldiers. Harvesting crews worked longer, harder, and under greater danger than ever before, driven by officers who cared nothing for the men lost to the great sandworms that rose from beneath the dunes to swallow harvesters whole. For there were always more workers to replace the dead, and profit did not pause for grief.
Water, always the most precious substance on Arrakis, became, under Rabban's governorship, not merely scarce, but a deliberate instrument of control. The wells and cisterns that sustained the poorer settlements were monitored and restricted, rationed out according to Rabban's whims rather than any measure of need. And those who displeased his officers, or who were simply unlucky enough to draw notice, found their water allowances cut, without warning or explanation. For a people who had spent countless generations learning to measure their lives in careful drops, who wore still suits to reclaim even the moisture of their own breath, this was a cruelty calculated with terrible precision, for it struck at the very foundation of survival itself, rather than at any comfort that might be more easily forgiven. The Fremen, the desert people who had long made their secret home in the deep sietches beyond the reach of the cities, bore the worst of this oppression, though they bore it with a patience and a hidden strength that Rabban, in his contempt for them, badly underestimated. He viewed them as little more than desert vermin, useful only as an occasional source of forced labor, or as targets for punitive raids meant to remind the wider population what defiance would cost. He did not trouble himself to understand their ways, their discipline, their deep and ancient traditions of survival, or the quiet ferocity with which they endured every hardship he inflicted upon them. He saw only bodies to be worked, and he never once imagined that among those bodies, hidden and unremarked, moved people who remembered every raid, every stolen well, every burned settlement, and who were patient in a way that no Harkonnen officer, bred to power and indulgence, could ever hope to match. Throughout the cities as well, Rabban's rule brought a suffocating weight of fear. Informers were rewarded, suspicion was constant, and those who spoke too freely against the new governor tended to vanish quietly, their fates left deliberately unexplained, so that the uncertainty itself became a kind of punishment for everyone who remained. Merchants found their goods taxed into ruin, families found their movements restricted, and the once merely difficult life of an ordinary Arrakeen city dweller curdled slowly into something far more desperate. Rabban did not concern himself with subtlety in any of this. He had never possessed much taste for it, and he did not now trouble himself to develop any, content instead to rule by the simple application of overwhelming and visible force, confident that fear alone would hold the planet in his uncle's grip. And yet, even as Rabban tightened his hold, something moved beneath the surface of Arrakis that neither he nor the Baron who had set him there could see. In the deep desert, far past the edges of the cities Rabban controlled so completely, small numbers of survivors from a household believed entirely destroyed were beginning, slowly and carefully, to find their way among the Fremen.
carrying with them a name that Raban believed had been erased from the universe forever. He governed his planet as though the matter of House Atreides had been fully and finally settled, never suspecting that his own harshness was, even then, preparing the ground for something he could not yet imagine. A hunger for change so deep and so patient that it would one day rise from beneath the very sands he thought he had subdued. Raban ruled from the same palace the Duke Leto Atreides had so briefly occupied, and he took a particular satisfaction in that arrangement, in sitting where his family's oldest enemy had once sat, in walking the same halls, and issuing his orders from the same seat of authority that had, for so short a time, belonged to a rival house.
He did not trouble himself to reflect upon the irony of ruling so harshly from a place his uncle had won only through treachery and betrayal. For Raban had never been a man given to reflection of any kind, and he found in the daily business of extraction and punishment a satisfaction that suited his temperament far better than any quieter form of governance might have. The great spice harvesting operations, upon which the entire wealth of Arrakis and much of the wealth of the Imperium ultimately depended, were pushed under Raban's governorship to a pace that spared little thought for the workers who operated them. Carryalls and harvesters moved constantly across the open desert, racing always against the arrival of the great worms that the vibrations of harvesting inevitably summoned, and where previous administrations had at least made some effort to balance profit against the safety of their crews, Raban's officers were instructed simply to keep the quotas flowing, whatever the cost in equipment or in lives. Spice was gold beyond any gold mined on any other world in the Imperium, for it alone made possible the safe folding of space that starships required to travel between the stars. And it alone sustained the strange, prescient awareness of the guild navigators who depended upon it utterly. The Baron understood this value intimately, and he demanded from Raban a flow of spice that left little margin for anything resembling mercy. Beyond the spice fields, ordinary life in the Arrakeen cities grew steadily more difficult beneath the weight of Raban's administration. Prices for even basic goods were manipulated to enrich the governor and his officers, and those merchants who resisted these arrangements found their licenses revoked or their warehouses subjected to sudden and inconvenient inspections that always seemed to uncover some fresh violation. Children in the poorer districts grew up knowing the sound of Harkonnen patrols moving through their streets, and learned early which questions were safe to ask aloud and which were better kept silent. A lesson that would, in later years, prove to have taught an entire generation exactly the kind of quiet patience that made for dangerous enemies. Up next in Chapter 15, The Hidden Harkonnen Blood, we'll uncover a secret buried deep within the bloodlines of both great houses. A truth the Bene Gesserit had kept hidden for generations, and one that would tie the fate of the Harkonnens to the very boy they believed the desert had already claimed. Beneath the long and violent history of the feud between House Harkonnen and House Atreides lay a secret so carefully guarded that even the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, a man who prided himself on knowing every hidden lever of power in his own family and beyond it, did not know it concerned him directly until circumstances forced a portion of the truth into the light. It was a secret belonging not to the great houses themselves, but to the ancient and patient order that had been arranging bloodlines for its own purposes across 10,000 years. The Bene Gesserit, whose breeding program had been guiding certain families toward a single, distant purpose long before either the Harkonnens or the Atreides had risen to the prominence they now held. The Lady Jessica, who had served for many years as the bound concubine of the Duke Leto Atreides and had borne him his son Paul,
was herself a product of this ancient program. Raised and trained from childhood within the Bene Gesserit schools, taught the subtle arts of observation, control, and command that made the Sisterhood's agents so valuable and so feared throughout the Imperium. What Jessica herself did not fully know, and what only the highest orders of the Bene Gesserit understood in its complete shape, was the true nature of her own parentage. She had been told, as many children raised within the Sisterhood's careful arrangements were told, only what she needed to know to serve her assigned purpose. And the truth of her father's identity had been kept from her as carefully as any secret the Bene Gesserit had ever guarded. Jessica was, in fact, the daughter of the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen himself. Born of a liaison the Baron had never been permitted to understand the full purpose of. Arranged quietly by the Sisterhood as part of a breeding scheme that reached back across countless generations and forward toward an outcome only the Bene Gesserit fully comprehended. The Baron had fathered a daughter he never knew as a daughter, a child taken at birth and raised within the Sisterhood's schools, shaped into precisely the kind of woman the Bene Gesserit required for their purposes, and then placed, by the same quiet design, into the household of the very man whose family stood as House Harkonnen's oldest and bitterest enemy.
The Bene Gesserit had intended, in placing Jessica with the Duke Leto Atreides, for her to bear him only daughters, for their long calculations required a particular joining of bloodlines to be completed in a specific and careful order across future generations. A plan aimed at bringing forth, at last, the singular figure the Sisterhood had been working toward for 10,000 years. A being they called the Kwisatz Haderach. But Jessica, moved by a love for her Duke that the cold calculations of the Sisterhood had never fully accounted for, defied her orders and gave him the son he so deeply wished for instead, a boy named Paul. And in doing so, she set loose a piece that no longer moved entirely according to the Bene Gesserit's careful design. And so it was that Paul Atreides, the boy the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen believed had perished along with his mother somewhere in the merciless wastes of Arrakis, carried within his own blood the very lineage of the house that had destroyed his father and driven his family from their home. He was, through his mother, a grandson of the Baron himself, an heir of Harkonnen blood, raised as an Atreides, trained in the discipline and honor of the house his grandfather had spent a lifetime scheming to destroy. It was an irony so complete, so perfectly folded back upon itself, that had the Baron known of it in that hour of his triumph, it might have tempered even his deepest satisfaction. For the very blood he believed he had spilled and scattered across the sand carried, in its secret way, a portion of his own. The purpose behind this long and careful breeding arrangement had always been larger than any single feud between two great houses. The Bene Gesserit had spent 10,000 years guiding chosen bloodlines toward one another across the whole of known space, seeking to bring forth a single individual whose mental powers would exceed anything the Sisterhood itself could achieve. A bridge across time and space and thought that they intended to control absolutely once he emerged. Jessica's defiance, born of love rather than obedience, had disrupted their careful timeline by perhaps a full generation. But it had not destroyed their design entirely. For in the boy Paul, born a generation early and outside the exact conditions the Sisterhood had planned for, the possibility of that long-awaited figure still lived, carried quietly across the desert by a mother who had chosen love over doctrine. None of this was known to Rabban as he governed his broken planet with an iron and indifferent hand. And none of it was known to the Baron as he savored what he believed to be the complete destruction of his oldest enemy. The secret remained buried within the private records and long memories of the Bene Gesserit alone.
a truth too dangerous and too consequential to be spoken aloud, even among those few who understood its shape. And yet it moved forward regardless, unseen and unstoppable, carried in the blood of a boy who was, in that very hour, learning new ways among a people the Harkonnens had never troubled to understand. A boy who was Atreides in name and upbringing, and Harkonnen in blood, and who would one day return to settle accounts neither house could have foreseen. The desert that Raban ruled with such careless cruelty, believing it fully subdued, was already sheltering the seed of the very reckoning that would end his family's name. Though the Baron continued to sleep soundly in his fortress at Giedi Prime, entirely unaware of the quiet irony curled within his own bloodline, or of how thoroughly his enemies had woven themselves, unseen, into the fabric of his own house.
To understand how such a secret could remain hidden for so long, one must understand something of the patience and discipline of the Bene Gesserit themselves, an order that thought not in years or even in generations, but in centuries, weaving bloodlines across the great houses of the Imperium, the way a careful weaver might work threads through a loom too vast for any single lifetime to see completed. Marriages were arranged, liaisons were quietly engineered, and children were placed within households not for love or convenience, but for the precise genetic qualities they carried forward. All of it directed toward a single, distant purpose that only the Reverend Mothers at the very highest levels of the sisterhood were permitted to fully understand. Jessica's placement with Duke Leto Atreides had been one thread among countless others in this vast design, chosen with exacting care because of what her Harkonnen blood, joined with the Atreides line, was calculated to produce. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, for all his cunning in matters of politics and commerce, had never been permitted so much as a glimpse into the true workings of the Bene Gesserit breeding program, and this too had been by design. For the sisterhood trusted the ambitious and the powerful with only as much knowledge as served their purposes, and never a fraction more. Had the Baron known that the concubine of his enemy carried his own blood, he might have acted very differently in the long years of his scheming, though whether that knowledge would have softened his cruelty or merely redirected it towards some other, more intimate design, none can say with certainty. For the Baron was not a man whose heart softened easily, even toward blood of his own making. Jessica herself carried the weight of this hidden truth without ever fully knowing its shape, sensing, perhaps, in some quiet corner of her trained awareness that her origins held a mystery the sisterhood had never troubled to explain to her, and choosing, as she had chosen so often before, to set aside questions she could not answer in favor of the more immediate work of protecting the son she loved. It would fall to Paul himself, in the years still to come, to learn the fullest truth of his own strange and doubled inheritance, and to carry that knowledge forward into a destiny far larger than either the Harkonnens or the Atreides had ever imagined for their long and bitter feud. Up next in Chapter 16, The Gladiator Games of Giedi Prime, we'll return to the black sun of the Harkonnen homeworld, where Feyd Rautha prepares for his 100th kill in the arena, and where the Baron watches his beautiful, dangerous heir with a calculation of his own. On Giedi Prime, beneath the dim and heavy light of its distant sun, the arenas of the Harkonnen homeworld had long served as one of the family's most treasured indulgences, a place where cruelty was polished into spectacle, and where the young men of the house were permitted, even encouraged, to prove themselves before crowds who had gathered for exactly this kind of entertainment. It was into this arena that Feyd Rautha, the Baron's chosen heir and the most carefully groomed of all his nephews, walked on the day of his 100th kill,
an occasion the Baron had arranged to be celebrated with all the extravagance that Harkonnen wealth could provide. Feyd-Rautha had been raised almost from infancy with the expectation that he would one day stand at the center of moments exactly like this one. And by the time he reached his 18th year, he had already absorbed every lesson his uncle and his tutors had thought necessary to prepare him for rule. He was beautiful, in the particular way the Harkonnens valued, graceful and quick, his movements in the arena carrying an economy and a flair that made even his violence appear almost like art. The crowds who filled the stands on the day of his 100th kill had not gathered merely to watch a slave die.
They had gathered to watch Feyd-Rautha perform, for that was precisely what these spectacles have become under the Baron's careful cultivation. A stage upon which his heir's growing reputation could be built session by session, kill by kill, before a population trained to admire him. The gladiator brought before Feyd-Rautha on that day was a slave whose name has not survived in any record worth remembering, one among the countless unfortunates who had been purchased or captured across the years to serve this single grim purpose. But this contest, like so many the Harkonnens arranged, was not entirely what it appeared to be to the crowd watching from above. The Baron, ever mindful of his nephew's safety, even as he prized his nephew's growing legend, had ordered that the slave be drugged before the match, his body dosed with substances meant to slow his reflexes and dull his instincts for self-preservation, ensuring that whatever danger Feyd-Rautha appeared to face in the arena was considerably smaller than it seemed to those watching from the stands. The spectacle of risk was, in this way, carefully separated from risk itself, a distinction the crowd was never meant to notice and rarely did. Feyd-Rautha, for his part, understood some portion of this arrangement, though he chafed privately against it, that he possessed an appetite for genuine danger that his careful uncle preferred to keep contained rather than indulged. He wished, in his private ambitions, the contests that tested him truly, that carried real risk and therefore real glory. But the Baron's caution regarding his heir's safety generally won out over Feyd-Rautha's hunger for authenticity, and so the young man learned to perform his courage as skillfully as he performed his swordsmanship, understanding that the crowd's belief in his danger mattered more, in the end, than the danger itself. On this particular day, however, a portion of the truth had slipped free of the careful arrangements meant to contain it. Word had reached Feyd-Rautha, through channels he trusted, that the slave he was to face had not been drugged as instructed, that some failure or some deliberate sabotage within his own household had left this particular gladiator fully alert and fully capable of the violence the arena demanded of him. Feyd-Rautha, rather than retreating from this unexpected danger, chose to meet it, understanding on some deep level that a true test of his skill, survived and won before the eyes of the assembled crowd, would serve his ambitions far more powerfully than another safely staged performance ever could. The contest that followed was closer and more genuinely perilous than any that had come before it, and when Feyd-Rautha finally emerged victorious, the ovation that rose from the stands carried a different, more electric quality than the polite enthusiasm his earlier, safer victories had earned him. The Baron, watching from his private box with the cold and assessing eye he brought to every matter concerning his family, understood immediately what had happened, and understood as well that his own household had been the source of the danger his heir had faced. He suspected, correctly, that this had been the work of a slave master seeking to curry favor by giving the crowd a genuine spectacle. Or perhaps something more calculated still, a subtle testing of the heir's mettle, arranged without his own knowledge. Whatever its origin, the incident revealed to the Baron a truth he had long suspected, but preferred not to examine too closely: that even within his own walls, At the very center of his own power, ambition and intrigue moved constantly beneath the surface of every arrangement he believed himself to control completely. This was, in its way, the truest lesson of Giedi Prime, more enduring than any single contest fought within its arenas. Power on that world was never simply held. It was constantly tested, probed, and quietly contested by those near enough to reach for it. And the Baron, who had spent his own long life clawing his way upward through exactly this kind of endless maneuvering, understood better than anyone how little safety even his position at the very top of his house actually provided him. He watched his nephew accept the crowd's adoration with the practiced grace Feyd-Rautha had been taught to display, and he allowed himself a moment of genuine pride in the young man's poise, even as some colder portion of his mind began quietly calculating whether an heir capable of surviving unplanned danger and of turning it so gracefully to his own advantage might one day prove capable of turning his ambitions toward the Baron's own position as well. It was the particular tragedy of House Harkonnen, repeated across its long and violent history, that even its triumphs contained within them the seeds of its own future betrayals. That no kill in the arena and no ovation from the crowd could ever fully satisfy a family built upon suspicion and cruelty rather than trust. And that the very heir the Baron had spent so many years grooming for greatness was already, in the quiet places of his own ambition, beginning to wonder how much longer he intended to wait before reaching for everything his uncle currently held. The arenas themselves, vast structures built beneath Giedi Prime's dim and heavy sky, had stood for generations as one of the great public rituals of Harkonnen rule. A place where the ordinary people of that grim industrial world were permitted their entertainment and their spectacle in exchange for whatever hardships their daily lives under Harkonnen governance otherwise demanded of them. The Baron understood, as his father and grandfather had understood before him, that a population given regular spectacle and the illusion of shared glory in a rising young champion was a population far less likely to trouble itself with harder questions about the conditions of its own existence. And so the arenas were maintained lavishly, their contests announced and celebrated with a pageantry that stood in stark contrast to the gray and joyless cities surrounding them.
Feyd-Rautha's tutors, in the years leading up to this 100th kill, had drilled him relentlessly, not only in the arts of combat, but in the subtler art of being watched, of carrying himself in a way that made every gesture in the arena appear larger and more significant than it truly was. He had learned to pause at precisely the right moments before a killing stroke, to let his eyes find the crowd rather than his opponent in the instant before victory, to accept applause with a practiced humility that made the watching thousands feel as though they themselves had somehow contributed to his triumph. This too was a kind of training the Baron valued every bit as highly as swordsmanship. For a Harkonnen who could command a crowd's affection, even a crowd as distant and as brutalized as the common people of Giedi Prime, possessed a tool of governance that brute force alone could never fully replace. The Baron's private thoughts that day, watching his nephew accept the crowd's roar, moved also toward the larger question of succession that had occupied him for years without ever being fully resolved. Rabban, brutal and useful, would never be permitted to inherit the full weight of Harkonnen power, for the Baron judged him, correctly, to be a tool best suited to tasks requiring force rather than subtlety. Feyd-Rautha, by contrast, possessed the charm, the cunning, and now, increasingly, the proven nerve that true rule would require. And it was toward Feyd that the Baron's long-term ambitions for his house's future had always quietly bent.
whatever affection or wariness he permitted himself to feel toward the young man in the meantime. Up next in Chapter 17, the desert storm rises. We'll return to Arrakis, where a new power is gathering in the deep desert among the Fremen, and where the boy the Harkonnens believed lost to the sand is preparing, quietly and patiently, to return. There came a season on Arrakis when the wind itself seemed to have chosen a side, and the side it had chosen was not the Harkonnen side, for the desert had always belonged to those who could read its moods, and now, at last, those who could read its moods had risen to claim what had always been theirs. The Fremen, who for so many generations had been dismissed as scavengers of the deep Urg, a hidden people of no consequence, worth counting only as a nuisance to be swept aside whenever their raids grew too bold, had become something else entirely, something that Rabban and his garrisons could not name, and therefore could not fight. And this new thing wore the name of Muad'Dib, the name that Paul Atreides had taken for himself among the Sietch dwellers, a name meaning the desert mouse who knows how to survive where nothing survives. And beneath that gentle name, there moved an army of a kind the Imperium had not reckoned with in 10,000 years. It is worth resting a moment on how quietly this transformation had happened, for that is often the way of true power, that it grows in silence and reveals itself only when it can no longer be undone. Paul had come to the desert as a fugitive, a duke's son with a dead father and a shattered house, and the Fremen had taken him in, not out of pity, but because they saw in him something that matched their prophecies. Prophecies that, though the boy did not yet know it, had been seeded among them generations before by the Bene Gesserit missionaries of the Missionaria Protectiva, so that when a stranger came speaking the old words and moving with an uncanny grace, the desert folk were already prepared to believe. Paul had learned the ways of the sand, had ridden the great worms that the Fremen called Shai Hulud, had taken a Fremen name and a Fremen woman, Chani, daughter of Liet Kynes, and in learning to survive, he had also learned to lead. And leading among the Fremen meant becoming something more than a duke's heir. It meant becoming a religious figure, a warrior prophet whose visions of the future carried the weight of scripture. Under his hand, the scattered Sietches, which had for centuries guarded their independence jealously and fought as often among themselves as against outsiders, began to draw together into something resembling a single force, disciplined by the harsh mathematics of desert survival and sharpened by the weirding ways, the Bene Gesserit fighting arts that Paul's mother, the Lady Jessica, had brought with her into exile and had taught without restraint once she understood that survival required it. And so the raids that had once been small, a strike here, a stolen shipment there, grew larger and better coordinated, until they were no longer raids at all, but campaigns. And the target of those campaigns, again and again, was the substance upon which the entire Imperium turned its slow and terrible wheel, the spice melange itself. Let it be understood clearly and calmly, as one understands the turning of a season, that spice was the marrow of Harkonnen wealth, more precious to the Baron than any garrison or any palace. For it was spice that had bought the loyalty of factors and bureaucrats, spice that had purchased silence in the Landsraad, spice that had, in the end, purchased the Emperor's own complicity in the destruction of House Atreides. And it was precisely this vein of wealth that Paul's Fremen now moved to sever, methodically, with the patience of people who had always measured their lives against the slow patience of the desert. Harvesting crawlers, those vast machines that combed the open sand for the telltale signs of a spice blow, began to vanish, swallowed by ambush or by the worms that the Fremen had learned to summon and guide with an intimacy that no off-world engineer could hope to match. Carryalls sent to lift the crawlers to safety were shot from the sky or arrived too late, And more than once an entire operation, dozens of workers and millions in equipment, was simply erased from the ledgers of Harkonnen profit, swallowed by sand and silence. Rabban, who had been left on Arrakis by his uncle the Baron to squeeze the planet dry after the fall of House Atreides, found himself now in an impossible position, commanding garrisons that understood open combat and city policing, but had no answer for an enemy that could vanish into a dune and reappear 100 kilometers distant. An enemy that read the deep desert the way a courtier reads a treaty. He doubled patrols, and it did not matter. He fortified the spice routes, and it did not matter. He executed hostages from the sieges he could find, hoping to terrorize the Fremen into submission. And this too did not matter, for it only bound the desert people tighter to the man they were beginning to call the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, the Messiah their oldest legends had promised them. Rabban's own reports back to Giedi Prime, when he dared send the truth at all, spoke of spice production falling by fractions that no Harkonnen accountant could make disappear on paper. And every failure was a stone added to a weight that was slowly, inexorably crushing the confidence the Baron had once placed in his brutal nephew. The Baron himself, aging now, his enormous body suspended more and more by the suspensor fields that carried the weight his own flesh could no longer bear, received these reports in his private chambers on Giedi Prime with a fury that had nowhere honest to go. For he could not admit to the Emperor or to the Landsrat that his conquest of Arrakis, so carefully purchased and so publicly celebrated, was unraveling in the hands of a boy he believed he had ordered killed years before, on the night the Atreides household fell.
He raged at Rabban through the distorted intimacy of Distran's messages. He considered and reconsidered sending Feyd Rautha to relieve his brother of command. And beneath all of this circling anger, there moved something quieter and colder. A suspicion he could not yet fully name, that the Desert War was no longer a matter of profit margins at all, that it had become something with the shape of destiny. And destiny, as the Baron understood in the marrow of his ancient cunning, was not a thing that could be bribed, tortured, or purchased into submission. Word reached him, too, of the Sardaukar losses, for the Emperor Shaddam IV had at last committed his own terrible legions to the fight, disguising them in Harkonnen uniforms so that the Landsrat would not learn the Emperor himself had gone to war against a duke's dispossessed son. And even the Sardaukar, bred and drilled on the prison planet of Seleucia Secundus to be the most feared soldiers in the known universe, found the open desert a graveyard they had not expected. Whole units failed to report. Supply lines meant to be inviolable were bled dry by sabotage. And Paul's name, or rather the name Muad'Dib, spread across every siege until it was no longer a rumor, but a certainty. And certainty is a kind of gravity that pulls all loose and wavering things toward it. The Baron did not yet know how near his own end had drawn, for he still believed, in the stubborn way of men who have ruled too long, that enough cruelty applied with enough patience could turn back any tide, even one made of sand and prophecy. He summoned Feyd Rautha and spoke to him in low, careful tones of contingencies, of what must be done if Arrakis could not be held. And even as he spoke, he refused, in the deepest chamber of his own pride, to believe that House Harkonnen's great prize, bought with so many years and so much blood, could truly slip from his grasp. But the storm that was rising in the deep desert did not care what the Baron believed. It was already moving, vast and patient as the worms themselves, toward Arrakeen. And so the desert storm gathered its strength quietly through those long months, unseen by any orbital survey and unmeasured by any Harkonnen ledger, for its true instrument was not weaponry alone, but belief.
the slow binding together of thousands of sieges into a single purpose. A purpose the Baron's spies on Arrakis, working through corrupted agents and bribed officials, could sense only as a vague and troubling absence. A growing silence where profit used to be. And silence, to a man like the Baron, who had built his entire fortune on being able to purchase knowledge of every plot against him, was more frightening than any open rebellion could ever have been. Up next in Chapter 18, The Death of the Baron, we'll follow the final assault on Arrakeen itself and learn how a child not yet born, Alia, daughter of the desert, brought an old and terrible reign to its grotesque and fitting end. The night the storm finally broke over Arrakeen, it broke in a form no Harkonnen strategist could have foreseen, for it came wearing the shape of a great and terrible Coriolis wind, the kind of storm the Fremen alone knew how to read and use. And Paul, Muad'Dib, had waited for precisely such a storm, patient as the desert itself, so that it might blind the Emperor's shields and the Harkonnen censors alike, while his gathered legions, riding the very worms of Arrakis as their ancestors had never dared to imagine possible in such numbers, came pouring toward the city that had once been the seat of Duke Leto Atreides and had since become the throne of Harkonnen cruelty. It is enough for a resting mind to know that the city fell, and that it fell not in the manner of a slow siege, but in the manner of a long-held breath finally released, swift and complete, and that within its walls the last defenders of the old order, Sardaukar and Harkonnen alike, discovered that the desert had, at last, come to collect what it was owed.
Within the palace itself, in the confusion of that final night, there occurred an event that deserves to be told slowly, gently, the way one tells of a thing already settled and finished, so that the mind may rest upon it without alarm. Alia, the younger sister of Paul, had been born only months before, yet she was born already awake in every sense that mattered, for she had been transformed within her mother's womb during the terrible ordeal Lady Jessica underwent to become a reverend mother among the Fremen, an ordeal in which Jessica drank the water of life, the poison distilled from a drowned sandworm, and transmuted it within her own body, and in doing so, she had passed that same terrible awakening to the unborn child she carried. Because of this, Alia had come into the world already possessed of the full memory and awareness of every reverend mother who had come before her in the long chain of the Bene Gesserit, an inheritance that, in an ordinary child, would have arrived slowly across years of training, but in Alia arrived all at once, before her first breath, so that she was, from the very hour of her birth, something the universe had rarely seen and would rarely see again. A mind ancient beyond calculation, housed inside a body still learning to walk. It happened that in the chaos of the palace's fall, Alia was separated from her mother and found herself, by the strange and terrible logic that governs such nights, in the presence of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen himself, who had been brought to Arrakis in the final hours in hopes that his presence might yet rally the failing defense, and who now sat helpless in the grip of the very suspensors that had for years spared his enormous body the burden of its own weight, unable to flee, unable to fight, waiting in the dim light for whatever the night still owed him. He looked upon the small child before him and did not yet understand what stood in front of him, for how could he, seeing only an infant where in truth there breathed a being who carried within her the full weight of 10,000 years of women's memory. Women who remembered every cruelty the Harkonnen name had ever inflicted upon those who could not defend themselves. The Baron, it should be remembered gently, was himself unknowingly bound to this child by blood, for the secret chain of descent ran from him through his own natural daughter, born long before in a liaison he never acknowledged and scarcely remembered.
down through the generations of the Bene Gesserit breeding program, until it reached Lady Jessica herself, so that Jessica, and therefore Paul, and therefore Aaliyah, all carried Harkonnen blood within them, hidden and folded so deep into the design of that long breeding scheme that the Baron had gone to his final hour, never knowing that the woman he despised as an Atreides concubine, and the children born of her, were in truth his own descendants, closing a circle he could never have imagined and would never live to understand. Aaliyah approached him without fear, as an infant might approach any large and slow-moving thing, and the Baron, sensing something wrong in the stillness of her gaze, something old where there should have been only newness, felt for the first time in many years a species of dread, but was not simply the dread of physical harm, but the dread of being truly seen all the way down, in the way that only the dying are ever fully seen. In her small hand, she held a gom jabbar, the poisoned needle that among the Bene Gesserit had for centuries served as the final instrument of judgment, the same manner of testing device that had once been pressed near the throat of her own brother Paul in his youth, to determine whether he was man enough to master his instincts. But here it was put not to a test of character, but to an ending, quiet and absolute.
It is not necessary, in the telling of this, to linger upon violence, for violence is not the true substance of what happened in that room. The true substance was closure. The closing of an account that had been opened far too long. An account written in the blood of Duke Leto, in the suffering of the planet Arrakis, in the long cruelty of Raban's occupation, in every small and large horror that the name Harkonnen had authored across the years. The Meadle found him, and the man whose enormous body had for decades been sustained only by machines built to carry a weight his own flesh had grown too corrupt and too gluttonous to bear, whose mind had schemed across a lifetime for power that always seemed to slip a little further from his grasp, even as he grew richer and crueler in pursuit of it, breathed his last within moments, the poison working swiftly, and without any of the grand drama the Baron might, in his vanity, have wished for his own end. There was no final speech, no last desperate bargain, no reversal of fortune such as the Baron had always, somewhere in his cunning heart, believed he could conjure from any situation, no matter how dire. For he had spent his whole life believing that patience and treachery could purchase him escape from any trap. And in this, his very last trap, patience and treachery bought him nothing at all. He simply ceased, an old and enormous evil, deflating in the dim light of a palace that had never truly been his, on a planet that had never truly been conquered, brought low at last, not by armies or by rival houses, but by an infant who carried within her more centuries of memory than the Baron himself had lived years. A small and terrible justice, delivered without anger, delivered instead with the plain, unhurried certainty of the desert itself, which asks nothing of those who wrong it, except that, eventually, in its own patient time, they be swallowed. Outside, the battle for Arrakeen went on through the night, the Sardaukar legions breaking at last before the combined fury of the Fremen and the great worms they rode. And somewhere in the confusion, the Emperor Shaddam IV himself would soon be brought to kneel before the man he had once tried to destroy. But all of that belongs to another part of this long and settling story. For now, it is enough to know, quietly, as one settles deeper into rest, that the man who had ruled House Harkonnen with poison and patience for the better part of a lifetime was gone, and that the blood he had spent so many years spilling had, in its own slow circling way, found its way back to him at last. Elsewhere in the palace, in those same slow hours, the last threads of the old order were being cut, one by one, quietly,
without ceremony, the way a tapestry unravels once its central knot has finally given way. And among the Fremen who moved through those captured halls, there was little celebration, only the grim and settled satisfaction of a debt at last collected in full. A debt owed not merely to Paul or to his fallen father, but to every siege that had buried its dead beneath Harkonnen boots across the long years of occupation. The Baron's body was found by others soon after, and it was carried away without honor and without cruelty either, simply removed, the way one removes a stone that has finally stopped blocking a path. And no monument was raised to him, no eulogy spoken, for the desert does not pause to mourn what it has swallowed. In the years that would follow, the manner of his death would be told and retold among the Fremen, not as a tale of vengeance, but as a small and quiet parable of balance restored. A reminder that even the most fortified cruelty eventually meets something it cannot bribe, cannot frighten, and cannot outlive. And that the reminder came from an infant's hand seemed to the desert people entirely fitting. For the sand itself makes no distinction between the great and the small when the time comes to reclaim what it is owed.
Up next, in Chapter 19, The Last Harkonnen Falls, we'll follow Feyd-Rautha, the last true heir of a broken house, into a duel he believed he could win through treachery alone. After the fall of the Baron, and after the great battle at Arrakeen had settled into the strange quiet that follows any war that has finally decided its own outcome, there remained only one true heir of House Harkonnen, still capable of standing before the universe and claiming the name with pride rather than shame. And that heir was Feyd-Rautha, the nephew the Baron had groomed so carefully across the years to be sharper, subtler, and more dangerous than his brutish brother Rabban. A young man raised from childhood on lessons of poison and patience, on the slow cultivation of charm as a weapon every bit as deadly as any blade. It is worth remembering, as one drifts toward the end of this long and heavy story, that Feyd-Rautha had once stood in the great arena of Giedi Prime and won the adoration of a crowd bred to love cruelty, had once been offered by his uncle as the very model of what a Harkonnen heir should be, poised and beautiful, and utterly without conscience. Now, with the Baron dead and Rabban's fortunes on Arrakis broken beyond recovery, it fell to Feyd-Rautha alone to answer, in the way that the old customs of the Imperium demanded, for the debts his house had accumulated. The Emperor Shaddam IV, having seen his Sardaukar broken in the deep desert, and having been brought at last to kneel before Paul Atreides, now called Muad'Dib, in the captured halls of the Arrakeen Palace, sought still for some way to salvage his position. And in the ancient customs of the Landsraad, there remained a path that a cornered emperor and a cornered house might yet walk together. The path of Canly, the formal and ritualized feud that allowed old grievances to be settled not through the wholesale slaughter of armies, but through single combat between champions. A custom old enough to predate the Imperium itself, and sacred enough that even Paul, standing now at the height of his power, could not simply refuse it without seeming to abandon the very traditions that gave his own claim its legitimacy. And so it was arranged, in the strange formal calm that settles even over the bloodiest of transitions, that Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen would meet Paul Atreides in single combat, blade against blade, the last living instrument of his house's ambition, set against the young duke whose family the Harkonnens had destroyed. It should be understood gently that Feyd-Rautha did not walk into this duel as an honest man walks into a fair contest. For honesty and fairness
had never been currencies that House Harkonnen dealt in, and the Baron's teachings, even from beyond the grave, still moved in his nephew's hands. Feyd-Rautha had trained for such combat since childhood, had faced slaves in the arena who were themselves secretly given stimulants and drugs to make them appear more dangerous than they truly were, so that his victories would seem more impressive. And he had learned, above every other lesson the Baron pressed into him, that a fight was never to be entered without an advantage hidden somewhere close at hand. And so he came to the duel with Paul, carrying upon his person a poisoned blade, its needle tip treated with a toxin meant to end the contest long before skill or strength could decide it honestly. A small betrayal, folded inside a ceremony that was itself already a kind of theater, since Paul had, through channels of intrigue that reached even into Feyd-Rautha's own household, been warned in advance that treachery might be hidden somewhere in his opponent's grip.
The combat itself unfolded before the assembled nobles of the Landsraad and the humbled emperor, in the great hall of the palace that had once belonged to House Atreides and had been seized in blood by House Harkonnen, and was now, by the slow turning of fortune, about to belong to neither. And it is not the violence of that combat that deserves to be dwelt upon here, but rather its meaning. For what took place in that hall was the meeting of two young men who had, in their very different ways, been shaped entirely by the same long and terrible feud. One raised in exile and hardship to lead a desert people toward destiny, the other raised in luxury and cruelty to inherit an empire of fear. And in that single hour, the whole ancient quarrel between their two houses, a quarrel that had smoldered since the disgrace at the Battle of Corrin 10,000 years before, came at last to its narrow point.
Feyd-Rautha fought with every cunning his uncle had ever pressed into him, feigning weakness to draw Paul closer, offering openings that were never truly open. And at one point he did indeed manage to score Paul with the poisoned blade, a wound that should, by every calculation, have ended the contest and the man both. Yet Paul, trained since infancy in the Bene Gesserit disciplines his mother had passed to him, and hardened further by his years of survival in the deep desert among the Fremen, possessed a mastery over his own body's chemistry that allowed him to neutralize what should have killed him, turning aside a treachery that had worked, in its time, against countless lesser opponents in the arenas of Giedi Prime. And in that moment, when the poison failed and the last trick the Harkonnen line had to offer proved insufficient, something in the duel changed. For Feyd-Rautha understood, in the private clarity that comes only to those about to lose everything, that he faced now not merely a duke's son, but a man his own house's cruelty had, in its own perverse way, helped to forge. A man tempered rather than broken by every hardship the Harkonnens had inflicted upon his family. The end came without cruelty and without spectacle. For Paul, who had by then become something more than a duke or even an emperor in waiting, a man burdened already with visions of the terrible jihad his rise would set loose across the stars, whether he willed it or not, took no pleasure in what he was required to do, and dispatched Feyd-Rautha with the same grave economy that a physician might use in closing a wound. No wasted motion, no lingering vengeance, simply the completion of a thing that the old customs and the older feud had made unavoidable. Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, last true heir of a name that had once ruled Giedi Prime as absolute masters, and had clawed its way back from disgrace across 10 millennia, only to lose everything again in the span of a single generation, fell in that hall before the watching Landsraad. And with his fall, there passed from the universe the final legitimate claimant to the Harkonnen inheritance, the last man who might have carried the name forward with any authority at all. It is a strange and quiet thing to consider, as the mind settles toward its own rest, How completely a house so vast, so wealthy, so soaked in the profits of Arrakis and the fear of 1,000 worlds, could come apart within so short a span. The Baron dead by an infant's hand, Raban's occupation shattered in the desert, and now Feyd-Rautha, fallen in a hall that had once been Harkonnen by conquest, and would now belong, by right of blood and of victory both, to Paul Atreides, and to the house he was building from the ashes of the one that had tried to destroy him. The name Harkonnen did not vanish from the historical record that very night, for there remained holdings to be seized, minor kin scattered across distant worlds who bore the name without its power. But the great trunk of the tree, the line that had schemed and murdered its way from disgrace to dominance, was cut through at last, and what remained was only its slow, settling collapse. In the hush that settled over that great hall once the combat had ended, the assembled lords of the Landsraad understood, in the particular way that courtiers always understand such things quickly and without needing to be told twice, that they had witnessed the true and final turning of an age. For Canly, that old and formal instrument of vengeance, had at last balanced an account so old that few among them could even recall its true beginning. An account that had opened in disgrace at the Battle of Corrin and had been carried forward through 10,000 years of scheming. And now, in the space of a single, quiet duel, it was closed. Some among the watching nobles felt something that might, in a more honest court, have been called relief. For the long shadow that House Harkonnen had cast over the Imperium's affairs, a shadow of bribery and poison and quiet cruelty reaching into 100 different treaties and 1,000 different fortunes, had at last lifted. And though none dared say it aloud in that tense and formal hour, there was a sense, unspoken but shared, that something old and cold had finally been allowed to end. Up next in Chapter 20, The Name Erased from the Stars. We'll follow what became of the house's wealth and holdings after this final fall, and rest a while on the quiet truth that even the greatest cruelty, in time, returns to dust and sand. In the quiet that follows any great collapse, there comes always a season of accounting. And so it was with House Harkonnen, whose vast holdings, gathered across 10,000 years of ambition and cruelty, now passed under the calm and irreversible authority of the new order that Paul Atreides, called Muad'Dib, had raised from the desert itself. The Landsraad, which had for so long tolerated the Baron's schemes because they had proven profitable, and because no one had possessed the will or the power to oppose them, now watched in a kind of hushed and settled relief as the machinery of judgment finally turned against the name that had so long escaped it. Giedi Prime itself, that gray and joyless world the Harkonnens had built into the seat of the Black Sun, its skies dimmed by the smoke of its own foundries, its people worked and frightened into obedience across generations, passed from Harkonnen hands into the reordering that follows every empire's fall. And though the world itself endured, as worlds endure regardless of who claims to rule them, the name that had shaped its long suffering no longer carried any weight there at all. It is worth resting a moment upon the shape of that inheritance, for it tells its own quiet lesson. The fortunes drawn from Arrakis and from the great combine known as Chom, the fortunes multiplied across centuries of careful and merciless investment, the estates on a dozen worlds, the private armies, the hidden accounts, all of it, every last measure of wealth that Baron Vladimir Harkonnen had spent his whole long life accumulating with such patience and such cunning, was seized and redistributed in the manner that victors have always redistributed the spoils of the vanquished. And none of it, in the end, purchased the Baron so much as a single hour of continued existence. Nor did it purchase Feyd-Rautha safety in his final duel. Nor did it purchase Rabban mastery over a desert that had never once respected wealth as a form of power. The gladiatorial arenas of Giedi Prime, where so much cruelty had once been celebrated as entertainment, fell silent, their purpose exhausted along with the house that had built them, and the slaves who had once been forced to fight and die for the amusement of a bloated aristocracy were left, in the slow and uncertain way that follows any liberation, to build something else from what remained. The name Harkonnen itself, once spoken across 1,000 worlds with the particular blend of fear and grudging respect that great and terrible power always commands, began now to fade in the way that all such names eventually fade, not with a single dramatic erasure, but through the slow accumulation of silence, through the simple fact that there was no longer anyone left who held it, who mattered. No baron to scheme in his private chambers, no Rabban to terrorize a conquered population, no Feyd-Rautha to be groomed as its gleaming future. What minor kin remained, scattered across the Imperium, carried the name quietly now, a burden rather than a banner, and in time it would be remembered mostly in the histories, in the formal records of the Landsraad, and in the private memories of those who had suffered under it. Remembered the way one remembers a long winter after the spring has finally and fully arrived.
And it is here, in this last quiet turning, that the whole shape of the story becomes visible. The way a full journey only reveals its true form once it is finished, and one can look back across the whole of it at once. House Harkonnen began, 10,000 years before, in disgrace, cast down by an imperial tribunal for a cowardice committed at the Battle of Corrin, when Abulard Harkonnen had failed the newborn Corrino Empire in its very first hours and had been stripped of rank and title as punishment, and the house that carried his name forward spent every one of those 10,000 years clawing back toward the very power and respectability it had lost in that single moment of failure. It climbed slowly, patiently, first through commerce, then through calculated marriages and alliances, then through the black industries of Giedi Prime, and always, at every step of that long climb, it carried within it the particular bitterness of a house that believed itself owed more than the universe had given it. A bitterness that curdled, generation after generation, into a philosophy of cruelty as a kind of proof. Cruelty as the only language a wronged house believed the universe would ever truly respect. It found, at last, under Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, the summit it had sought for so long, the great prize of Arrakis itself, the planet whose spice fueled the entire Imperium, delivered into Harkonnen hands through a conspiracy so vast and so carefully constructed that it drew in even the Emperor of the known universe as a secret partner. And for one brief and terrible season, House Harkonnen stood as near to the very center of galactic power as it had ever stood, or would ever stand again. And in that brief season, all of the house's oldest instincts, cruelty and cunning, and an appetite for domination that had been sharpened across 100 centuries, were given their fullest and most terrible expression. In the massacre of House Atreides, in the long occupation of Arrakis under Rabban's brutal hand, in the careful grooming of Feyd-Rautha as the gleaming future of a name built entirely on other people's suffering. But power built upon cruelty carries within it always the seed of its own undoing. For cruelty teaches those who suffer it a patience of their own. And it was that patience
gathered across generations among the Fremen of the deep desert, that finally rose against the house that had thought itself untouchable, and brought it down not in one battle, but in a swift and total collapse. An old man killed by an infant's hand, a brutal governor broken by an enemy that could not be bribed or terrified, a groomed heir defeated in the one contest he believed treachery alone could win. The wheel that the Baron had spent his whole life trying to turn in his own favor turned instead, in the end, exactly as such wheels always eventually turn, returning every gathered thing to the ground from which it first arose. So it is with all such names, however vast, however feared, however certain of their own permanence they may seem in their hour of greatest power. For the sand of Arrakis and the slow turning of centuries do not distinguish in the end between the palace and the hovel, between the throne and the grave. And what one house builds across 10,000 years, the same patient forces that built it can just as surely and just as quietly take away. The foundries of Giedi Prime grew cold, the arenas fell silent, the great estates passed to other hands, and the name that had once made 1,000 worlds tremble became at last only a word in old records, spoken without fear, spoken without anger, spoken only as one speaks of a long and difficult winter that has finally, fully passed.
Even the memory of the house's crimes, so vivid and so painful in the years just after its fall, would, in time, soften into something gentler. Not forgiveness exactly, but the natural fading that comes to all sharp things left long enough in the slow current of years. So that generations later, the name Harkonnen would be spoken mostly by historians and scholars, piecing together the long chronicle of the Imperium. A cautionary name, a name attached to a lesson about the emptiness of power built on fear rather than trust. But no longer a name that could make a household fall silent or a child hide beneath a blanket. The great black fortresses of Giedi Prime, stripped of the wealth that had once maintained them, settled slowly into disrepair, their halls growing quiet, their once terrible masters replaced by administrators and by ordinary time, and the wind that moved through those cold corridors carried no more menace than the wind that moves through any abandoned place once its purpose has been spent. And now, as this long telling draws itself gently closed, let the mind rest upon that quiet truth and nothing more, that cruelty, however patient, however clever, however vast the wealth and fear it gathers around itself, is only ever borrowing its power from time. And time always calls its debts due, turning towers to dust and names to silence, until all that remains is the wind moving softly across an endless and untroubled sand, the desert settling back into the same deep and ancient quiet from which every empire, every house, every name first rose, and to which every one of them, eventually, and without exception, returns. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we traced the whole long shadow of House Harkonnen, a name born in disgrace at an ancient battle, a feud that never died, and the slow, patient climb back to power. We walked the iron world of Giedi Prime beneath its black sun, watched the rise of Baron Vladimir and his twisted mentat, the cruelty of the beast Rabban, and the grooming of Fade Rautha.
We followed the web of spice and wealth, the Emperor's secret bargain, the trap laid on Arrakis, and the traitor within the walls who brought the Atreides down. We saw the reign of terror on the desert world, the hidden Harkonnen blood carried by an enemy's own line, the gladiator games, and at last the desert storm that rose against them, the death of the Baron, the fall of the final heir, and a proud and terrible name quietly erased from the stars. There is nothing left now that you must carry. Let each of those cold and distant things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. None of this can touch you, and nothing here asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us and let a gentle subscribe keep them coming. There are many more long, slow tales waiting for the nights ahead.